In 2017, researchers watching live footage from 300 meters below the Black Sea saw something that should not have existed: a wooden ship with its mast still standing. For several seconds, nobody on the research vessel spoke. The ship was not modern, it was not medieval, it had gone down before the birth of Christ. And yet, under the ROV lights, the wood looked almost fresh. Ropes were still attached to the deck. Ceramic cargo jars still sat stacked inside the hull, exactly where sailors had placed them more than 2,000 years earlier. One wreck still carried its steering oar intact. This should have been impossible. In normal seawater, wood disappears quickly. Bacteria consume it. Fungi break it apart. Marine organisms bore through it until almost nothing remains. Most ancient shipwrecks survive only as stains in the sediment or scattered fragments of timber. But the Black Sea is not a normal sea. Below roughly 150 meters, the water contains almost no oxygen at all. No fish live there. No organisms capable of consuming wood survive there. Even the currents become weak and still. The deeper layer of the Black Sea has remained chemically isolated for thousands of years, turning the seafloor into something closer to a vault than an ocean. And because of that, entire pieces of the ancient world are still waiting in the dark, exactly where they fell: Greek merchant ships, Roman trading vessels, Byzantine ships with carved wooden sternposts still attached. Entire centuries of human history sitting silently beneath the water, untouched since the day they disappeared. Today, we descend into the Black Sea to understand why this place preserves the ancient world better than anywhere else on Earth. From above, the Black Sea appears ordinary. Coastlines curve around it the way coastlines curve around countless other bodies of water. Ports gather at its edges. Rivers empty into it. Storms move across its surface. On maps, it sits quietly between Europe and Asia, with the same deep blue coloring used for every other sea. Nothing in that distant view suggests that beneath its surface exists one of the strangest chemical environments on Earth, a place where the ordinary rules of decay stop functioning almost completely. The sea is nearly enclosed by land. Turkey forms its southern boundary, while Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, and Georgia circle the remaining edges. Only a single narrow connection links it to the wider ocean system beyond: the Bosphorus Strait, a thin waterway threading past Istanbul before opening into the Sea of Marmara and eventually the Mediterranean. At its narrowest point, the strait is only around 700 meters wide, a small opening for an inland sea of such scale. Water can move through it, but slowly, carefully, in quantities too limited to fully disturb what has accumulated inside the basin over thousands of years. Across Eastern Europe, enormous rivers carry fresh water steadily toward this enclosed sea. The Danube arrives from Central Europe after crossing forests, plains, and industrial cities. The Dnieper descends from the north. The Don approaches from the east. Together they pour immense quantities of river water into the basin, year after year, century after century. Because the Black Sea has so little exchange with the open ocean, much of that fresh water remains near the surface rather than circulating downward into the depths. Over time, the sea separated itself into layers. Near the top exists a lighter surface zone, influenced by river inflow and seasonal weather, a region containing oxygen, fish, plankton, drifting algae, and the constant movement associated with ordinary marine life. Waves stir it, storms churn it, sunlight reaches through it in shifting columns that brighten and fade with the passing day. To a depth of roughly 150 meters, the Black Sea behaves much like any other sea. Far below that boundary, the water changes completely. The deeper layer is older, colder, and much saltier, a dense mass of Mediterranean water that settled into the basin long ago and rarely rises again. Between the upper and lower layers lies a transition zone known as the chemicline, a quiet chemical frontier suspended in darkness beneath the surface world. Above it, oxygen circulates through living systems. Below it, oxygen nearly disappears. In that deep water, hydrogen sulfide accumulates instead, released by microorganisms adapted to conditions that most life cannot tolerate. The gas carries the faint scent of rotten eggs when encountered near the surface in small quantities, but here it exists in enormous concentration, saturating the depths in a chemistry hostile to almost every organism responsible for decay. The bacteria that normally consume dead organic material struggle to survive there. Wood-boring mollusks cannot live there. Fungi cannot spread there. The biological machinery that ordinarily dismantles wood fiber by fiber simply stops operating once a ship descends deep enough into the basin. This layered structure is called stratification, though the word hardly captures the stillness of it. In many lakes and seas, layers form temporarily before storms or seasonal cooling overturn the water and mix everything together again. The Black Sea does not behave that way. Its separation has remained remarkably stable for around 7,500 years, preserving the deep basin in a condition almost untouched by the atmosphere above it. The sea did not become this way gradually. Its strange chemistry began with violence, with water forcing its way through stone and transforming an entire landscape faster than the people living beside it could possibly understand. Long before merchant ships crossed the Black Sea carrying wine, grain, and oil between distant ports, the basin held something quieter. Its waters were fresh then, fed by rivers descending from forests and glacial plains, gathered into a vast inland lake lying far below the level of the Mediterranean, beyond the southwest horizon. Villages rested along its edges, where the ground sloped gently toward the shore. People fished from narrow boats close to land and planted crops in dark, fertile soil left behind by retreating ice. For generations, the shoreline moved only with the seasons, predictable enough for homes, storage pits, and paths worn into the earth by repeated footsteps. Across the northern hemisphere, however, the climate was changing. The great glaciers of the last ice age were withdrawing slowly toward the poles, releasing enormous volumes of meltwater into the world's oceans. Coastlines everywhere were shifting inward. Seas climbed river valleys and flooded ancient plains that had once stood dry beneath cold skies. The Mediterranean rose with them, pressing gradually against the narrow ridge of land at the Bosphorus, the final barrier separating salt water from the freshwater lake beyond. For centuries, the barrier held. Then it failed. The collapse may have begun with small fractures, channels cut by seepage through weakened earth and stone. Water would have entered first in violent streams, accelerating erosion with every passing hour. Once the breach widened beyond a certain point, the force became unstoppable. In 1997, geologists Walter Pittman and William Ryan calculated that seawater may have surged through the opening at roughly 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, a continuous torrent driving northeast into the lower basin with astonishing force. The Mediterranean did not spread evenly across the lake's surface. Saltwater is denser than freshwater, and as the flood entered the basin, it plunged downward immediately, sliding beneath the lighter freshwater already there. The lake began filling from below. Day after day, water levels climbed higher along the shorelines, where people had built their homes. Researchers estimate that at the flood's peak, the water may have risen by around 15 centimeters every day, enough for fields to disappear within weeks, and familiar beaches to vanish beneath advancing water before a season had fully passed. Entire stretches of inhabited land drowned beneath the rising basin. Forest edges became submerged, river mouths widened into inlets. Villages near the old shoreline would have watched the water consume pathways, storage areas, and farmland piece by piece until retreat became unavoidable. Boats once used for fishing close to shore may have become the only means of carrying possessions inland fast enough to stay ahead of the flood. Some scholars believe memories of this catastrophe survived in altered form across generations, carried into later flood traditions that appeared in distant cultures centuries afterward. Echoes of a world consumed by rising water drift through the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Noah, though the exact connection remains uncertain, blurred by the immense distance of time. What remained physically certain was the transformation of the basin itself. The old freshwater was gradually displaced upward, while the invading Mediterranean water settled permanently into the depths. Because the sea remained almost enclosed, with little circulation to mix the layers together, the dense salt water became trapped below the surface. Oxygen carried downward during the initial flooding was slowly consumed by bacteria, feeding on organic material, sinking through the water column. Century after century, the deep basin lost its oxygen completely. By around 5000 BCE, the lower Black Sea had entered the strange chemical condition that still defines it now, an immense anoxic reservoir sealed beneath living surface waters. The separation endured through the rise of cities, kingdoms, and empires around its shores. Every vessel that later vanished into those depths descended into chemistry shaped by an ancient flood, preserved inside water that had remained fundamentally unchanged since the end of the Ice Age. The first objective was not to search for ships resting in darkness, it was to search for a lost landscape. Researchers involved in the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project arrived with their attention fixed far beneath the sediment itself, toward traces of an older shoreline drowned thousands of years earlier when the basin transformed from freshwater lake to inland sea. Professor John Adams of the University of Southampton designed the expedition around that vanished world, hoping to locate submerged river valleys, ancient coastal contours, and perhaps the remains of settlements left behind by the people who once lived beside the pre-flood waters. The ships, when they eventually appeared, entered the story almost accidentally, emerging from the deep while the project was looking for something even older. The expedition began in 2015 with funding from a private exploration company interested in deep water survey technology and marine archaeology. Two research vessels operated together on the Black Sea, the Strill Explorer serving as the primary platform, while a support vessel handled logistics, equipment transfer, and communications. From above, the work often appeared methodical and quiet. Long hours spent tracing survey grids across open water while computers translated sonar returns into layered maps of the unseen seafloor below. The most important members of the expedition were not human divers, but remotely operated vehicles built for extreme depth. Surveyor Interceptor and Surveyor Defender descended through the water column suspended by cables, carrying power and data between the vehicles and the ship above. Each machine was equipped with high-definition cameras, sonar systems capable of mapping terrain in fine detail, and articulated manipulator arms precise enough to recover fragile material from the seabed without crushing it. They could dive to depths of roughly 2,000 meters, far beyond the safe range of conventional diving operations, entering regions where sunlight never reached and pressure weighed against every surface with enormous force. The survey area covered around 2,000 square kilometers of seabed, immense from the perspective of a research expedition, yet still less than 1% of the Black Sea as a whole. Sonar scans moved slowly across that darkness, building detailed acoustic images of slopes, sediment plains, and buried geological structures hidden beneath the water. Most of the returns matched expectations. Ancient river channels appeared beneath layers of accumulated mud. Former shorelines emerged as subtle ridges and terraces, preserved beneath sediment deposited over thousands of years. Then the patterns began to change. During the 2016 survey season, the sonar systems detected shapes that did not resemble natural formations. The outlines were too regular, too symmetrical against the surrounding seabed. Straight edges appeared where geology rarely produces straightness. Certain objects cast shadows with proportions suggesting height and structure rather than rock or sediment. Clusters of material lay arranged in ordered distributions, impossible to explain through ordinary underwater processes. At first, the anomalies existed only as faint images on monitors inside the survey vessel, pale geometric marks suspended in black digital space. The operators directed the remotely operated vehicles downward for closer inspection, guiding them carefully through the cold water until the seafloor emerged beneath the cameras. What appeared in the lights was not debris scattered beyond recognition. It was architecture shaped for water travel. Hull outlines rested upright on the seabed, with their forms still coherent beneath layers of fine sediment. Wooden structures retained dimension and alignment in ways that should not have survived prolonged submersion. Some vessels appeared almost complete from bow to stern, their proportions unmistakable even before closer examination revealed details of rigging, steering mechanisms, and cargo arrangements still preserved within them. The project had crossed unexpectedly from geology into archaeology, from drowned landscapes into a layered archive of maritime history extending across centuries. Each new survey line carried the possibility of another discovery waiting below the chemicline, another vessel resting in darkness where the chemistry of the basin had held it beyond the reach of ordinary decay, silent and intact beneath the slow movement of the research ships, tracing circles overhead. Inside the operations room aboard the Strill Explorer, most of the light came from monitors. Blue instrument displays reflected faintly across metal surfaces, while technicians and researchers watched the remotely operated vehicle descend through black water far below the hull of the ship above. The vehicle moved slowly, suspended beneath kilometers of cable, its cameras transmitting a continuous stream of images upward through the darkness of the basin. For much of the descent, there was little to see beyond drifting particles crossing the lights like pale dust in empty space. Then the water itself seemed to change character. At roughly 150 meters, the cameras entered the chemicline, the transition between the oxygenated upper sea and the anoxic depths below. The image softened slightly. A faint haze appeared across the frame, almost like smoke suspended underwater. The vehicle's lights revealed a thin shimmering layer where different chemistries met and barely mixed, a quiet boundary hanging invisibly through the basin. Below it, the seafloor emerged. The sediment looked untouched, a broad gray plain lying beneath still water where almost no current disturbed the surface. Fine particles had settled there gradually over centuries, forming soft layers across the bottom. Nothing moved through the camera frame except the vehicle itself and the occasional cloud of sediment stirred gently by its thrusters. Then, at the far edge of the lights, a shape interrupted the flatness. At first, it appeared only as darkness against darkness, a curved outline rising slightly above the sediment. As the vehicle moved closer, the geometry became unmistakable. Timber lines resolved into the side of a hull. Vertical forms emerged behind it. The silhouette of a mast extended upward into the black water above. For several moments, nobody in the operations room spoke. The expectation had been ruins, perhaps scattered planks or collapsed debris, half buried beneath mud. Instead, the cameras revealed a complete vessel resting upright on the seabed, as though the water had only recently closed over it. Hull timbers remained aligned, deck structures retained their shape, sections of rigging still hung in place. The ship did not resemble an archaeological abstraction reconstructed from fragments. It resembled a working vessel interrupted in the middle of its existence. The remotely operated vehicle drifted slowly along the starboard side, while the cameras recorded detail after detail with almost unsettling clarity. Near the stern, a carved wooden tiller remained mounted where a sailor had once gripped it to guide the vessel across open water. The wood surface retained visible texture beneath layers of fine sediment, neither collapsed nor consumed by the ordinary processes expected in submerged timber. Lengths of rope still clung to wooden cleats along the deck structure, wrapped in deliberate coils shaped by human hands centuries earlier. Under the artificial lights, the fibers looked dry in form despite the surrounding water, preserved in patterns so ordinary and practical that they seemed to collapse the distance between present and past. Nothing about the arrangement suggested ruin. It suggested interruption. Inside the hold, ceramic amphorae stood stacked in organized rows exactly where cargo handlers had positioned them before departure. Their curved forms rested together in tight configurations designed to prevent movement during rough seas. The symmetry remained intact. No scavengers had scattered them. No currents had shifted them across the seabed. Professor John Adams later described the experience as professionally disorienting, not because the team doubted the science behind the Black Sea's chemistry, but because the visual reality exceeded the mind's ability to absorb it immediately. Archaeologists are accustomed to working through absence, interpreting incomplete fragments, rebuilding vanished structures from damaged remains. The cameras were showing something different. They were showing preservation so complete that the ordinary visual language of age no longer applied. The vessel rested there in cold darkness, exactly as it had settled centuries earlier, held inside an environment that had quietly suspended decay. It became the first of 65 ships documented during the survey, each waiting beneath the basin in the same deep stillness, beyond light, beyond weather, beyond almost everything that usually erases the physical traces of human work. Wood rarely survives the sea for long. A wooden hull entering ordinary ocean water begins changing almost immediately, even before storms break it apart or currents drag it across the seabed. The process starts invisibly. Microscopic bacteria settle across exposed timber surfaces and begin digesting organic compounds within the wood itself. Fungi spread through damp fibers, softening structural strength layer by layer. Salt water penetrates every crack and joint, carrying oxygen into the grain where entire colonies of microorganisms feed continuously in the dark. Then larger destroyers arrive. Among the most effective is Teredo novalis, commonly called the shipworm, though it is not a worm at all. It is a bivalve mollusk, distantly related to oysters and clams, transformed by evolution into something specialized for consuming submerged wood. Its body is pale and elongated, adapted for life inside narrow tunnels bored directly through timber. At the front are small shell structures, functioning like rotating drills, grinding steadily into the surface while the organism advances deeper into the wood. The process begins when microscopic larvae drifting through seawater encounter exposed timber. A larva settles onto the surface and secretes chemicals that soften the fibers beneath it. Once attached, it starts boring inward, slowly excavating a tunnel while lining the walls behind itself with calcium carbonate, creating a hardened tube that protects the animal as it feeds. From outside, the timber may appear mostly intact at first. Inside, however, entire structural beams can become hollow networks of chambers and tunnels woven through the wood like roots spreading underground. In warm, oxygen-rich seas, the transformation can happen astonishingly fast. Ship timbers, attacked by dense shipworm populations, may lose most of their structural integrity within only 2 to 5 years. Ancient ports throughout history fought constant battles against them. Wooden piers collapsed from within. Harbor pilings weakened silently beneath the surface. Entire fleets required regular repair because the sea itself was always eating the vessels alive. The destruction caused by Teredo Navalis across human history exceeds that caused by storms, reefs, and naval warfare combined. Most ancient wooden ships do not survive because shipworms erase them long before archaeologists can ever reach them. By the time a wreck is discovered in ordinary marine conditions, little may remain beyond cargo, ballast stones, or faint stains in sediment marking where timbers once rested. Yet beneath the deep Black Sea, the process never begins. Teredo Navalis depends completely on dissolved oxygen. Without it, the animal cannot survive, cannot burrow, cannot reproduce. The larvae drifting through the upper waters of the sea never establish themselves below the chemocline because the environment there is chemically hostile to their metabolism. The same limitation governs the bacteria and fungi responsible for initiating most wood decay. They are aerobic organisms dependent on oxygen carrying energy through cellular processes that stop functioning in anoxic water. Beyond roughly 150 meters, the deep basin becomes a place where the ordinary ecological succession of decomposition simply fails to operate. The organisms that should dismantle a wreck arrive at the boundary and go no farther. Wood descending through the water column enters a region almost empty of the living systems designed to consume it. The result is not active preservation in the human sense. Nothing within the Black Sea repairs the ships or protects them deliberately. The basin does not strengthen the timber or halt time itself. It merely removes the conditions necessary for rapid biological destruction. A vessel sinking into those depths escapes the vast network of organisms that normally reduce wood back into sediment and dissolved nutrients. In shallow seas across the world, ancient ships vanish because life reaches them quickly and efficiently. In the Black Sea depths, life barely reaches them at all. The hulls resting there survived not through extraordinary construction or unusual luck, but through absence. The absence of oxygen removed the invisible engines of decay before they could begin their work. Ropes remained coiled because no organism unwound them molecule by molecule. Timbers remained standing because nothing hollowed them from within. The sea did not choose to preserve those vessels. It simply became a place where destruction could no longer complete its task. Ancient objects rarely look ancient in the way people expect. Stone statues lose their faces to weather. Bronze darkens and corrodes. Wood usually disappears altogether, leaving only stains in mud where timbers once rested. The vessels lying beneath the Black Sea complicated those expectations immediately. Under the lights of the remotely operated vehicles, some hulls appeared so complete that the mind searched instinctively for a simpler explanation, perhaps a recent wreck, perhaps a modern reconstruction lowered intentionally to the seabed. Human perception measures age partly through damage, and these ships carried far too little of it. The research team needed something more dependable than appearance. To establish the ages of the wrecks, Black Sea Map relied on radiocarbon dating, a method rooted in the slow transformation of matter itself. Every living organism absorbs carbon throughout its lifetime. Plants draw it from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. Animals consume it through food, and trees incorporate it gradually into every ring of wood they produce as they grow. Among the carbon atoms entering these living systems is carbon-14, a radioactive isotope formed naturally in the upper atmosphere and distributed across the planet through air, water, and biological exchange. While an organism lives, this exchange continues constantly. The ratio between ordinary carbon and carbon-14 remains relatively stable because new carbon is always entering the body. Once the organism dies, however, the exchange stops. No new carbon-14 arrives. The isotope already present begins decaying at a predictable rate, transforming slowly over thousands of years through radioactive breakdown. That rate is extraordinarily steady. Carbon-14 has a half-life of approximately 5,730 years, meaning half of the original quantity disappears over that span of time. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains inside a sample compared with the expected original level, researchers can estimate how long it has been since the organism stopped living. For a shipwreck, the relevant moment is not the sinking itself, but the felling of the tree used to build the vessel. A timber cannot be older than the tree from which it came. The date, therefore, provides a minimum age for construction and usually places the vessel within a relatively narrow historical period. The remotely operated vehicles collected samples carefully. Manipulator arms extended toward non-structural portions of the wrecks where small pieces of wood could be removed without damaging the integrity of the vessels. Even these actions unfolded slowly, with the caution of archaeologists, aware they were touching objects preserved across spans of time, difficult to fully comprehend. Back aboard the research vessels, the samples entered laboratories where their isotopic composition could be measured precisely. The resulting dates stretched across an astonishing range. Some vessels proved relatively recent, only around 100 years old, reminders that the Black Sea continued preserving ships well into the modern era. Others reached far deeper into history. The oldest confirmed wreck dated to around 400 BCE during the classical Greek period. The timber holding that date came from a world still inhabited by Plato and Aristotle, from an era before the rise of Rome as an imperial power, before the birth of Alexander the Great. Somewhere along the Black Sea coast, shipwrights shaped those planks, while Greek colonies traded grain, wine, oil, and ceramics across the inland sea. After construction, the vessel sailed, carried cargo, encountered weather, crossed familiar routes known to navigators through memory and stars. Then at some point, in conditions now lost to history, it descended beneath the surface and settled into darkness, where it remained undisturbed for approximately 2,400 years. The radiocarbon analysis confirmed what the cameras had already implied with almost impossible clarity. These were not recent losses disguised by unusual conditions. They were not geological accidents mistaken for ships. They were exactly what they appeared to be: ancient vessels held intact by chemistry so stable that entire centuries passed around them without significantly altering the wood from which they had been built. The dates transformed the wrecks from remarkable discoveries into something quieter and stranger, physical moments from distant civilizations still resting where they had come to a stop. Before Rome controlled the Mediterranean, before Byzantine merchants crowded the Bosphorus with grain fleets and war galleys, Greek sailors were already moving across the Black Sea in narrow wooden vessels stitched together with remarkable precision. The oldest wrecks resting in the deep basin belonged to that world, to the classical Greek period when maritime trade linked scattered colonies across thousands of kilometers of coastline through constant movement of cargo, language, and people. The Greeks called the Black Sea the Pontos Euxanos, the hospitable sea. The name carried a certain tension within it because the basin was known as both opportunity and danger. Winds could shift quickly across its enclosed waters, and unfamiliar coastlines stretched beyond the comfort of the Aegean world. Yet the sea also offered grain, timber, fish, metals, and trade routes reaching deep into regions that supplied the growing demands of Mediterranean cities. Greek colonies formed a loose chain around the coastline. Sinope stood along the southern shore in what is now northern Turkey. Trapezus lay farther east beneath steep mountains, descending toward the water. Olbia emerged near the northern river systems, carrying resources from the interior plains. Chersonesos developed on the Crimean coast. These settlements acted less like isolated cities and more like connected commercial nodes, tied together by ships moving steadily between harbors throughout the sailing season. The vessels themselves were designed primarily for cargo. Many belonged to a type now called amphorae carriers, merchant ships built around the efficient transport of ceramic storage jars filled with wine, olive oil, preserved fish, and other goods moving between ports. Their dimensions remained modest by later standards, typically between 15 and 25 meters long, yet their holds could carry several tons of material across open water with surprising efficiency. The construction methods preserved within the wrecks revealed a level of craftsmanship historians had only partly understood from surviving texts and artwork. Greek shipbuilders used what archaeologists call shell-first construction. Instead of building an internal frame and attaching planks afterward, the outer hull itself came first. Shipwrights assembled the planking edge to edge, gradually shaping the vessel's exterior before inserting internal supports inside the completed shell. The planks were joined through mortise and tenon construction, one of the defining technologies of ancient Mediterranean shipbuilding. Along the edge of each plank, workers carved carefully measured rectangular slots. Into these openings, they inserted matching wooden tabs called tenons, locking neighboring planks together with remarkable precision. Wooden dowels, known as trenails, secured the joints tightly in place. No iron nails held the primary structure together. No metal framework reinforced the hull. The strength came from wood joined directly to wood, each piece shaped with enough accuracy that the entire vessel flexed as a unified structure against waves and shifting cargo. The wrecks discovered in the Black Sea preserved these joints in extraordinary detail, allowing researchers to examine surfaces untouched since antiquity. What emerged from those examinations surprised many naval historians. The joinery appeared more refined and more standardized than earlier scholarship had suggested. Measurements repeated with consistency across multiple vessels, implying organized shipbuilding traditions capable of producing reliable construction methods generation after generation. These were not crude, experimental craft assembled through improvisation. They were products of an experienced maritime industry operating across the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea with technical confidence. Most of the ships carried a single square sail mounted on a central mast. When winds failed or maneuvering became necessary near shore, crews relied on oars to maintain movement. The voyages demanded patience and familiarity with seasonal weather patterns because the Black Sea rewarded careful timing and punished mistakes quickly. The men sailing those routes returned repeatedly to the same harbors, crossed the same trade corridors, and trusted the same vessel beneath their feet season after season. Somewhere within that long repetition of departures and arrivals, one autumn voyage ended differently. A Greek merchant ship Descending now through the Black Sea darkness, settled onto the seabed, with its hull intact, its cargo still arranged in the hold, and its construction preserved so completely that shipwrights working more than 2,000 years later could still read the decisions carved into the wood. Inside the holds of the Black Sea wrecks, the cargo still waits in careful rows. Ceramic jars lean against one another exactly as ancient dockworkers arranged them before departure, packed tightly to reduce shifting during rough water. In some vessels, the amphorae fill nearly the entire interior space, rising from the floor of the hold in dense geometric patterns shaped by trade, balance, and habit. They are among the quietest objects on the seabed, yet they contain an extraordinary amount of information about the world that produced them. An amphora was designed for movement. Tall and narrow, with two curved handles and a pointed lower end, the vessel could be stacked efficiently inside ships or pressed upright into racks of sand and rope. Most stood between 60 and 90 centimeters high, large enough to carry substantial quantities of cargo while still remaining portable for laborers moving goods through crowded harbors. The pointed base allowed amphorae to settle securely against one another in the curved floor of a ship's hold, turning hundreds of separate containers into a tightly interlocked mass, stable enough for long voyages. Although the general form remained recognizable across centuries, every producing region developed its own variations. The angle of a shoulder, the thickness of a neck, the shape of a handle, all acted almost like regional accents preserved in fired clay. Experienced merchants could often identify the origin of an amphora at a glance. Archaeologists now read those same details with similar familiarity, tracing commercial connections through subtle differences in form that survived long after the cities themselves changed or disappeared. Many amphorae also carried stamped markings impressed into the clay before firing. Workshops identified their products through symbols, names, or abbreviated inscriptions linked to specific manufacturers and magistrates overseeing production. Some stamps recorded standardized capacities used for taxation and trade accounting. Others reflected local administrative systems that shifted over time, allowing researchers to narrow dates with remarkable precision. The clay itself preserves another layer of information. Different regions contain distinctive mineral compositions shaped by local geology, and laboratory analysis can match amphora fragments to the landscapes where they were produced. Combined with typology and stamped markings, these studies often identify not only where a vessel originated, but approximately when it entered circulation, sometimes within only a few decades. The contents can also survive in subtle chemical traces absorbed into the porous ceramic walls. Residue analysis extracts microscopic molecular signatures left behind by substances stored inside the jars centuries earlier. Under laboratory examination, the amphorae reveal cargoes that once moved routinely across the Black Sea and Mediterranean trade routes. Wine traveled in immense quantities between coastal settlements. Olive oil crossed water from warmer southern regions toward colonies farther north. Fermented fish sauce, known as garum, one of the ancient world's most widespread flavorings, appears repeatedly within the chemical record preserved inside certain containers. The arrangement of these cargoes has altered historians' understanding of ancient commerce itself. Earlier models often imagined trade as relatively simple movement between fixed points, one city exchanging goods directly with another in controlled transactions described by surviving texts. The wrecks suggest something more fluid and interconnected. Some ships carried amphorae produced in multiple different cities within the same hold, indicating voyages that accumulated cargo gradually through repeated stops at separate ports. A vessel might depart one harbor partially loaded, exchange goods elsewhere, add new cargo from another settlement, and continue onward through a constantly shifting network of coastal trade. The commercial system resembled an extended chain of movement rather than isolated exchanges between distant rulers. Goods circulated through overlapping routes, maintained by ordinary merchants, sailors, and dock workers, moving continuously around the basin. One amphora type appears especially often throughout the wrecks: the Sinopean amphora, produced in the coastal city of Sinop along the southern Black Sea shore. Its repeated presence across different ship types and historical periods suggests that Sinop functioned as a long-term commercial anchor within the regional economy for more than 1,000 years. Written sources alone hinted at the city's importance, but the cargoes resting silently in the deep water reveal it with unusual clarity, preserving patterns of trade too ordinary for ancient historians to record, yet steady enough to shape the economic rhythm of the entire sea. A shipwreck is not only the remains of a vessel, it is the physical shape of a disaster, preserved after everything else has vanished. The wrecks scattered across the Black Sea floor do not all rest in the same posture. Some lean slightly into the sediment, while others remain upright with remarkable balance. Cargo lies clustered differently from one vessel to the next. Broken timbers point in separate directions. Each arrangement records a sequence of final events that unfolded above the water long before the ships entered the stillness below. Marine archaeologists read these patterns carefully because sinking leaves signatures behind. A vessel overwhelmed suddenly by violent weather often carries the marks of abrupt structural stress. Masts may break under shifting wind loads or collapse during impact with heavy seas. Rigging can appear tangled or scattered beyond the hull, where snapping lines and falling spars tore through the deck. Cargo sometimes shifts violently toward the bow, evidence that the stern lifted sharply while the ship pitched downward during its final descent through rough water. Other wrecks suggest slower endings. When flooding progresses gradually through hull damage or weakened seams, the internal arrangement of a ship changes differently. Cargo settles more evenly as water fills the hold over time. Smaller personal objects drift toward the stern, where crew members often gathered while attempting to manage pumps, steerage, or emergency repairs. The geometry of the wreck becomes quieter, less explosive, shaped by prolonged imbalance rather than sudden collapse. One vessel discovered during the survey carried signs of fire. Portions of timber near the stern displayed visible charring concentrated around the location where a ship's hearth would normally have stood. Ancient merchant crews cooked aboard using small sand-lined fire areas built carefully into the deck structure, practical necessities during long voyages, but also constant hazards within wooden ships carrying tar, rope, oil, and dry cargo. On this wreck, the burn patterns suggested flames spread beyond control before the vessel reached the seabed. Several ships were also missing their anchors entirely. Working vessels of the ancient world did not travel without anchors. They represented security during storms and stability near uncertain coastlines. Their absence on multiple wrecks suggests desperate final decisions made under worsening conditions. Crews likely deployed them in attempts to hold position against wind or current, hoping the ship could survive until the weather eased or repairs succeeded. Somewhere above the wreck sites, those anchors may still rest buried separately in sediment, connected to moments when sailors fought to keep their vessels from drifting into catastrophe. The absence of human remains across the surveyed wrecks carries its own meaning. bodies do not usually remain within sinking ships for long. In most conditions, they rise back toward the surface through natural buoyancy during decomposition. The sea reclaimed the crews differently from the vessels they sailed. What remains below is not the people themselves, but the spaces they occupied and the objects they last touched. That absence sharpens the stillness of the wrecks. A ship preserved in deep water becomes almost like a paused action rather than a ruin. The tiller remains where someone last held it. Cargo stays arranged according to decisions made during loading. Tools, ropes, containers, and cooking equipment remain positioned inside a geometry shaped by work interrupted suddenly and never resumed. One wreck in particular appears to have descended with almost terrifying speed. Its cargo remained fully loaded and perfectly ordered inside the hold, with no evidence that the crew attempted to throw weight overboard to stabilize the vessel. No sign suggested organized evacuation or emergency unloading. The arrangement implied a sudden event, perhaps a fast-moving squall or catastrophic structural failure that gave the sailors almost no time to respond. For the men aboard that ship, the world transformed from open surface water to descending darkness within only minutes. The vessel crossed from motion into silence, carrying every detail of that transition with it. Then the chemistry of the basin closed around the wreck and held the scene in place. The sea did not merely preserve the ship itself. It preserved the exact physical arrangement created by the disaster, the final configuration of wood, rope, cargo, and absence left behind after the storm had already moved on above the water. For nearly 1,000 years, almost every commercial voyage, entering or leaving the Black Sea, passed beneath the shadow of one city. Constantinople stood at the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia narrow toward each other, controlling the single maritime passage connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean world beyond. Ships carrying grain, timber, wax, wine, oil, furs, ceramics, and countless smaller cargoes moved through that corridor continuously during the Byzantine era, their journeys shaped by taxes, inspections, political alliances, and imperial authority centered within the city. The Black Sea became not simply a body of water, but an economic interior linked directly to the fortunes of Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire emerged from the eastern half of the Roman world after the division of imperial administration during late antiquity. Founded formally in 330 CE, when Emperor Constantine established Constantinople as the new imperial capital, the state endured until 1453, surviving centuries of invasions, dynastic struggles, religious conflict, and shifting borders. Through much of that long history, control of the Bosphorus allowed Byzantine rulers to dominate maritime trade, moving into and out of the Black Sea basin. Every merchant vessel sailing those routes encountered the empire in some form. Harbor fees, customs duties, permits, and inspections generated enormous wealth for Constantinople while reinforcing its influence across surrounding regions. The city itself depended heavily on maritime supply lines. At its height, the population may have approached 500,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers on Earth during the medieval period. Feeding such a population required a constant flow of grain arriving by sea. Much of that grain came from the fertile plains north of the Black Sea, especially territories corresponding to modern Ukraine and southern Russia. Vast agricultural regions produced wheat in quantities large enough to sustain imperial markets hundreds of kilometers away. Merchant vessels crossed the basin, carrying those harvests toward Constantinople, transforming the sea into a moving extension of the empire's food system. The ships themselves evolved considerably from the smaller Greek merchant craft resting in older layers of the seabed. Byzantine cargo vessels became broader and deeper, with rounded hulls designed to maximize carrying capacity while reducing the number of sailors required to operate them efficiently. Their proportions reflected an increasingly organized commercial system where moving bulk goods reliably mattered more than speed or maneuverability alone. Rigging systems also changed. Earlier, Mediterranean merchant ships relied heavily on square sails effective with favorable winds, but limited when conditions shifted. Byzantine vessels adopted more complex arrangements, using triangular lateen sails capable of catching wind from a wider range of angles. These sails allowed captains greater flexibility navigating the Black Sea's unpredictable weather patterns and confined coastlines. A ship equipped with latent rigging could sail closer into the wind, adjusting course with more control during difficult passages. The wrecks discovered by Black Sea Map preserved these technological developments with remarkable clarity. Several Byzantine vessels remained so structurally intact that every major timber still rested in alignment with the original construction plan. Frames curved upward through the sediment, exactly where shipwrights had placed them centuries earlier. Hull planking retained its relationship to internal supports with almost unsettling precision. For naval architects and maritime historians, the discoveries offered something unusually rare: the ability to reconstruct Byzantine ship design directly from complete physical evidence rather than fragments, illustrations, or written descriptions. Measurements once debated in academic papers could now be examined in preserved wood. Construction methods inferred indirectly from texts appeared fully visible beneath the water. Some of these vessels may belong to the empire's final centuries, when Byzantine authority weakened under external pressure and internal fragmentation. Trade networks that had operated across the basin for generations became increasingly unstable as Ottoman power expanded through the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks after a prolonged siege, ending Byzantine control of the Bosphorus and closing a chapter of maritime history that had lasted more than a millennium. Yet, beneath the Black Sea, the ships themselves remained where they had settled. Cargo routes vanished, governments collapsed, languages shifted, and political borders changed repeatedly above the water, while the vessels that once sustained the empire continued resting silently in the dark, their hulls still carrying the shape of a civilization built around trade, grain, and the narrow strait connecting two worlds. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the sea routes did not disappear with it. Grain still moved across the Black Sea. Timber still drifted south from northern forests. Merchant captains still followed familiar coastlines through changing seasons and uncertain weather. What changed was the empire controlling the narrow passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire inherited the Bosphorus, the ports surrounding it, and the immense strategic advantage that came with governing the only maritime exit from the basin. For centuries afterward, Ottoman authority shaped the commercial life of the Black Sea in much the same way Byzantium once had, through taxation, regulation, military protection, and control of movement between regions. Ships entering or leaving the sea passed beneath Ottoman oversight, their cargoes feeding an expanding imperial economy stretching across southeastern Europe, Anatolia, the Middle East, and North Africa. The vessels preserved on the seabed from this later period reveal subtle but important changes in ship design. Compared with many Byzantine merchant ships, Ottoman working craft often sat lower in the water and carried broader beams relative to their overall length. Their hull forms reflected adaptation to the specific conditions of the Black Sea, particularly the shallower coastal waters along the northern shores and estuaries where river trade connected inland territories to maritime routes. Construction methods evolved as well. Shipwrights continued drawing from older Mediterranean traditions, yet the Ottoman wrecks display different joinery patterns and shifting preferences in timber selection. Certain hull structures appear lighter and more flexible than their Byzantine predecessors, suggesting refinements shaped by practical experience across generations of regional sailing. Some vessels also preserve evidence of gun ports built directly into the hull, small openings designed for light artillery or defensive weapons. The appearance of armed merchant shipping reflected broader changes unfolding across the early modern world. Maritime trade increasingly moved through politically unstable waters, where piracy, warfare, and naval competition blurred the distinction between commercial vessel and military asset. A cargo ship might carry grain and passengers while still needing the ability to defend itself against attack. The goods transported through the Ottoman Black Sea also differed from earlier centuries in important ways. Timber from the Pontic forests moved southward for shipbuilding and construction. Animal furs traveled from colder northern territories into imperial markets. Grain remained one of the sea's most important commodities, harvested across the Ukrainian steppe and distributed through Ottoman urban centers dependent on imported food supplies. Alongside these cargoes moved something less visible in the archaeological record, yet deeply woven into the economic history of the region. Enslaved human beings transported from Crimea and the Caucasus into markets throughout the empire. The Black Sea slave trade persisted across centuries and involved enormous numbers of people captured through raids, warfare, tribute systems, and political exchange. Contemporary written records describe the trade extensively, tracing routes, prices, and destinations with disturbing clarity. The seabed itself preserves almost none of this directly. Ceramic vessels survive, hull planking survives. Anchors, ropes, storage containers, and cooking tools remain where they settled. Human cargo leaves little physical trace within a ship's hold after centuries underwater. The silence surrounding that absence becomes part of the archaeology itself, a reminder that material preservation often favors objects over lives. The Ottoman-era wrecks, therefore, exist within a broader sequence extending deep through the layers of Black Sea history. Greek merchant vessels rest in older sediment horizons. Byzantine cargo ships appear above and beside them. Ottoman hulls settle later within the same basin, shaped by new political systems yet traveling many of the same waters. Together they form something unusually continuous, not isolated discoveries separated across museums and archives, but a direct physical chronology lying within a single body of water. In most places, centuries overwrite one another until earlier worlds disappear almost completely. Here, the sea accumulated them carefully instead. Different civilizations sank into the same darkness, one after another, their ships resting silently within reach of each other beneath the sediment, preserving 2,000 years of maritime activity as overlapping layers of wood, cargo, and forgotten routes beneath the Black Sea surface. Long before modern meteorology explained atmospheric pressure systems or katabatic winds, sailors crossing the Black Sea already understood that its weather could change with unsettling speed. Ancient writers returned to the subject repeatedly. Homer described violent seas and dangerous coasts at the edges of the Greek world. Strabo wrote of harsh storms and cold northern waters. Ovid, exiled to the Black Sea frontier during the Roman period, complained of freezing winds and hostile conditions. Polybius recorded sudden weather shifts, capable of overwhelming ships before crews had time to react. The sea earned this reputation partly because of its geography. Unlike open oceans where storms can disperse across vast distances, the Black Sea is enclosed on nearly every side by land. Mountain ranges and broad continental plains surround the basin, shaping air movement in ways that intensify weather rather than soften it. Wind crossing the confined water surface builds steep waves in compressed intervals, creating short, powerful swells that strike vessels repeatedly before a hull has time to recover from the previous impact. For smaller wooden ships, these conditions were often more dangerous than the longer rolling waves of open ocean environments. A steep, close wave pattern places enormous stress on hull structures and rigging, especially when cargo shifts inside the hold. Ancient merchant vessels depended heavily on balance. Even minor instability could become catastrophic once weather began forcing the ship sideways against successive waves. Among the most feared weather systems in the region was the Bora, a cold, dry wind descending suddenly from the mountains and steppe regions northeast of the basin. The Bora belongs to a category known as katabatic winds, air masses accelerated downslope by gravity as colder, dense air spills rapidly from elevated terrain toward lower coastal regions. In the Black Sea, these winds could strengthen from near calm conditions into gale force violence within less than an hour. Sailors familiar with the region learned to recognize certain warning signs: subtle temperature drops, shifting cloud formations, unusual stillness before acceleration. Yet even experienced captains could be caught in dangerous conditions before reaching shelter. Bora winds, exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, generated chaotic seas capable of overwhelming lightly built merchant craft with alarming speed. Because of these risks, maritime traditions throughout the Greek, Roman, and Byzantine periods generally restricted regular Black Sea navigation to the calmer months between April and October. Winter voyages were avoided whenever possible. Harbors became quieter during colder seasons while ships underwent repairs, crews dispersed temporarily ashore, and merchants waited for more stable weather before resuming long-distance trade. But economic life rarely moved according to ideal conditions alone. Grain spoiled if delayed too long in storage. Contracts demanded delivery schedules. Armies required supply movement, regardless of season. Merchants operating on debt could not always afford to wait through unfavorable weather windows. Captains working for commission earned income only when cargo arrived successfully. The pressure to continue sailing often outweighed the dangers everyone involved already understood perfectly well. The distribution of wrecks, discovered by Black Sea Map, reflects these realities with striking consistency. Many vessels lie in open water rather than clustered near reefs or rocky coastlines associated with navigational mistakes. Their locations correspond closely with known storm corridors and regions where Bora conditions historically became most dangerous. The ships appear not to have struck obstacles, but to have been overtaken directly by weather itself. This pattern suggests a sea where experienced navigators still lost vessels despite understanding the environment intimately. Ancient sailors were not blindly wandering unfamiliar waters. They followed established routes refined across generations, carried local knowledge about coastlines and winds, and planned voyages around seasonal expectations whenever circumstances allowed. Yet the structure of maritime commerce placed physical risk unevenly upon different people. Wealthy merchants financing cargoes often remained safely ashore, while crews and captains absorbed the immediate dangers of the voyage itself. A sailor confronting darkening weather on an exposed deck rarely owned either the ship beneath him or the goods inside its hold. His labor depended on continuing the passage despite uncertainty. So the voyages continued. Season after season, ships left harbor because grain still needed moving, timber still needed transport, and distant markets still waited beyond the horizon. Some completed the crossing countless times. Others entered weather that changed too quickly for wood, rope, and human judgment to overcome. The sea accepted those vessels into the same darkness, preserving them now, holding the physical evidence of storms long after the winds themselves disappeared. Most ancient history survives through monuments, inscriptions, and the possessions of powerful people. The Black Sea wrecks preserve something quieter. They preserve ordinary routines, the repetitive, practical habits that filled long days aboard small trading vessels, moving slowly across dark water. Near the sterns of several ships, archaeologists found compact cooking areas built directly into the deck arrangement. These were not elaborate kitchens, but small hearth spaces lined with clay or sand to contain heat safely aboard wooden vessels. Beside them rested ceramic cooking pots, blackened by repeated exposure to fire, along with stone mortars worn smooth through constant grinding. Their placement reveals how carefully life at sea was organized inside extremely limited space, every object positioned according to balance, accessibility, and necessity. The crews carried grain rather than prepared bread for many voyages. Flour spoiled more quickly in damp maritime conditions, while whole grain could survive long passages if kept dry. Sailors grounded themselves aboard the ship, often during calmer stretches of travel when the sea allowed steadier movement. Flatbread baked over heated stones became a dependable staple, plain and repetitive, but durable enough for weeks away from shore. Fish supplemented that diet whenever conditions permitted. Several wrecks preserved small lead sinkers still associated with fishing equipment carried on board. The weights are simple in shape, functional rather than decorative, designed only to lower lines beneath the surface, while the vessel drifted or moved slowly under weak wind. Their survival suggests that fishing over the side formed a routine part of daily life rather than an occasional activity. A calm afternoon at sea could become an opportunity to add fresh food to the ship's limited provisions. Fresh water remained far more important than food itself. Although the Black Sea contains lower salinity than many oceans, its water is still unsafe to drink in meaningful quantities. Merchant crews therefore transported fresh water in sealed ceramic containers or wooden casks, carefully rationed across the voyage. The location and number of these vessels mattered enormously. A damaged container or unexpected delay at sea could place the entire crew at risk long before food shortages became severe. At night, illumination came from small oil lamps placed near sleeping areas toward the stern. Some were ceramic, others bronze, all designed around remarkable simplicity. A shallow reservoir of olive oil feeding a wick that burned with low, steady light. Sailors slept in shifts wherever space existed between cargo, rigging equipment, and structural beams. The available room aboard many merchant vessels was astonishingly small. A crew of perhaps 5 to 15 men might spend weeks inside a living area smaller than a modern apartment studio. Within that confined environment, every movement became collective. Men worked, ate, repaired equipment, slept, argued, and watched weather changes within arm's reach of one another. Privacy scarcely existed. The ship itself became a temporary floating society governed by routine, hierarchy, exhaustion, and shared dependence upon the sea remaining navigable. Among the most revealing objects recovered from the wrecks are the lead-sounding weights used for navigation. These heavy conical tools were lowered repeatedly over the side to measure depth as ships approached coastlines or entered harbor approaches. At the base of each weight sat a hollow cavity packed with tallow, a sticky animal fat capable of trapping fragments from the seabed below. An experienced navigator could read remarkable amounts of information from those samples. Fine sand, shell fragments, dark mud, coarse gravel, each corresponded to particular stretches of coastline known through memory and repetition rather than maps in the modern sense. Combined with depth measurements, currents, landmarks, stars, and seasonal wind patterns, the sounding weight allowed sailors to estimate position with surprising precision. The preserved wrecks hold these objects exactly where working hands last placed them. The mortar beside the hearth, the lamp near the sleeping space, the sounding weight, ready for another lowering. None were intended to become artifacts. They were tools belonging to people occupied with ordinary tasks aboard vessels that happened at one irreversible moment, to descend beneath the surface and enter the stillness waiting below. Far beneath the visible surface of the Black Sea, there is no single moment where ordinary seawater suddenly becomes alien. The transition happens gradually, through a broad, submerged boundary where one chemical world fades into another. Oceanographers call this region the chemocline, a layered zone extending across roughly 50 to 100 meters of depth, where oxygen dwindles, hydrogen sulfide rises, and the familiar biology of the upper sea begins to disappear. The water within this boundary is unstable in a quiet chemical sense. Oxygen, descending from above, encounters sulfide compounds rising from below, creating shifting reactions that never fully settle into uniformity. Particles drift through the layers carrying traces of both worlds at once. The deeper a descending object travels through the chemocline, the less recognizable the surrounding environment becomes, compared with normal marine conditions elsewhere on Earth. Hydrogen sulfide dominates the deeper basin below. The gas is toxic to most complex organisms and carries the distinctive chemical signature of oxygen absence. Its presence in the Black Sea originates largely from sulfate-reducing bacteria inhabiting deep waters and sediments, microorganisms capable of surviving without dissolved oxygen by metabolizing sulfate compounds instead. As they process those compounds, hydrogen sulfide emerges as a metabolic byproduct and accumulates gradually through the isolated deep basin. These microorganisms belong to a lineage far older than animals, forests, or even breathable air itself. Their method of survival predates the oxygen-rich atmosphere modern life now depends upon. For immense stretches of early Earth history, before photosynthetic organisms transformed the atmosphere, microbial ecosystems resembling those within the Black Sea chemocline dominated the planet. The chemistry preserved below the Black Sea surface therefore reflects something ancient, not only in age, but in biological ancestry, a lingering fragment of conditions once widespread across the young Earth. More than 2 billion years ago, oxygen existed only in tiny amounts within the atmosphere and oceans. Microbial life, adapted to oxygen absence, flourished across much of the planet until cyanobacteria and other photosynthetic organisms slowly altered global chemistry through the release of oxygen as a metabolic waste product. That transformation, often called the Great Oxygenation Event, permanently reshaped Earth's atmosphere and allowed more complex forms of life to evolve. Yet beneath the Black Sea, remnants of that older biological world still persist. At the upper edge of the chemocline lives a remarkably specialized community known as green sulfur bacteria. Unlike plants or algae that rely on water during photosynthesis, these organisms use hydrogen sulfide instead, harvesting energy under extraordinarily dim conditions where sunlight barely penetrates. The amount of light reaching them measures less than a tiny fraction of surface illumination among the faintest environments known to support photosynthetic life. Their existence gives the chemocline an almost layered temporal quality, as though different eras of Earth's biological history occupy neighboring depths. Near the surface swim fish, plankton, and modern marine organisms dependent on oxygen-rich conditions. Deeper down survive microbial systems whose metabolic strategies emerged before oxygen became common at all. Below the chemocline, biological activity contracts dramatically. The deep water is not entirely lifeless. Certain sulfate-reducing bacteria continue inhabiting sediment layers and suspended particles. But compared with ordinary ocean ecosystems, the basin approaches something close to a natural void. Larger organisms vanish almost completely. Wood-boring mollusks cannot survive there. Aerobic bacteria responsible for ordinary decay cannot function normally within the oxygen-starved environment. For a descending ship, the chemocline becomes more than a scientific boundary. It marks the passage between two entirely different systems of time. Above it, biological activity constantly dismantles organic material through feeding, decomposition, and circulation. Below it, those processes slow almost to stillness. A vessel crossing that threshold enters water where familiar cycles of destruction no longer operate in the expected way. Timber settles into cold darkness, untouched by the organisms that would ordinarily consume it. Rope, cargo, and carved wood descend into conditions shaped by ancient chemistry and microbial worlds older than complex life itself. The ship continues downward through the fading boundary, then comes to rest in a place where decay has almost nowhere left to begin. Shipwreck preservation is usually a race against time that conservators know they cannot truly win. The moment a vessel sinks, biological decay begins dismantling wood, iron, rope, leather, and cloth through countless slow chemical reactions. Even when archaeologists recover a wreck in remarkable condition, bringing it back into air often creates a second crisis. Waterlogged structures that survived underwater for centuries can begin collapsing almost immediately once drying starts. The history of maritime archaeology is filled with extraordinary efforts to delay that collapse. In Stockholm Harbor, the Swedish warship Vasa sank during its maiden voyage in 1628 after traveling less than 2 kilometers from shore. Built as a heavily armed royal warship, it rolled under strong wind, took on water through open gun ports, and descended into the harbor at a depth of roughly 32 meters. More than 3 centuries later, in 1961, archaeologists raised the vessel from the seabed in one of the most ambitious maritime recovery operations ever attempted. The ship survived unusually well because the Baltic Sea's low salinity limited the spread of wood-boring organisms that destroy submerged timber elsewhere. Yet, even in those comparatively favorable conditions, the Vasa emerged from the water structurally fragile after 333 years underwater. Conservators immediately faced the problem of preserving waterlogged wood exposed suddenly to air. Without intervention, evaporation would cause the timber cells to shrink and collapse under their own weight. For 17 years, specialists sprayed the ship continuously with polyethylene glycol, a wax-like water-soluble compound designed to replace moisture within the wood and stabilize its internal structure. Hundreds of scientists, Engineers and technicians became involved in preserving a single vessel less than 4 centuries old. The Mary Rose required similarly extraordinary measures. The Tudor warship sank in 1545 during battle in the Solent off southern England. Raised in 1982, after 437 years underwater, the surviving hull emerged deeply weakened by centuries in relatively shallow, oxygenated conditions. Conservators spent more than a decade spraying chilled water across the exposed timbers, simply to prevent rapid deterioration while more permanent treatment systems were developed. Even the Titanic, resting far deeper than either vessel beneath the North Atlantic at approximately 3,800 meters, continues deteriorating despite cold temperatures and immense pressure. Since its discovery in 1985, researchers have documented increasing structural collapse, caused partly by iron, consuming bacteria, gradually feeding upon the hull itself. Large sections of the wreck are expected to disintegrate within future decades as corrosion and microbial activity continue their slow work. Against this broader history of maritime preservation, the Black Sea wrecks become almost difficult to comprehend properly. They require no museum climate systems, no chemical spraying, no refrigeration, no stabilization tanks, no emergency conservation laboratories filled with engineers monitoring humidity and structural stress. The environment surrounding the wrecks has already performed those functions naturally for centuries or millennia without interruption. A Greek merchant vessel resting beneath the Black Sea has remained preserved for roughly 2,400 years, while requiring no human maintenance whatsoever. Hull planking, steering equipment, cargo arrangements, rope, and carved structural details survive in conditions that rival or surpass ships recovered after only a fraction of that time elsewhere. The comparison changes scale itself. The Vasa became internationally famous because preserving a wooden ship for 300 years underwater was considered extraordinary. Entire museums were built around sustaining its survival after recovery. The Black Sea Basin, meanwhile, contains vessels more than 7 times older, resting passively within a chemical environment that continues protecting them automatically. Nothing about the system was engineered intentionally. No civilization designed it. No preservation strategy was planned in advance. Geological history, restricted circulation, microbial chemistry, and oxygen absence combined accidentally to create perhaps the most effective, long-term conservation environment on Earth. Most archaeological preservation involves fighting continuously against natural processes determined to erase the past. In the Black Sea, nature itself became the conservator instead. The basin simply holds what enters it, maintaining ships in cold darkness through centuries of political collapse, war, migration, industrialization, and scientific discovery above the surface. The result is not merely preservation but suspension, a stillness so complete that some vessels appear less like ruins than ships waiting quietly for their crews to return. For most of archaeological history, discovery and removal were treated almost as the same act. A shipwreck found beneath the sea was expected to be raised, transported, conserved, displayed, and studied in museums far from the water where it had rested. The Black Sea wrecks challenged that instinct from the beginning, not only because of their extraordinary preservation, but because modern technology offered another possibility, one where the ships could remain exactly where they were and still become accessible to researchers across the world. That possibility emerged through photogrammetry. At its simplest level, photogrammetry transforms photographs into precise three-dimensional space. Thousands of overlapping images taken from slightly different positions allow specialized software to identify matching points across each frame. Once enough visual reference points are recognized, the software calculates their exact geometric relationships and reconstructs the surfaces they belong to with remarkable accuracy. The principle resembles the way human depth perception works through two eyes viewing the world from slightly different angles, except photogrammetry expands that process across thousands of images captured systematically from every possible direction. For the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project, remotely operated vehicles followed carefully programmed survey paths around each wreck site. The machines moved slowly above the vessels at controlled altitudes while high-definition cameras captured continuous overlapping imagery. Every section of hull, every exposed timber, every amphora, rope fragment, steering component, and deck feature was photographed repeatedly from multiple positions. A single survey could generate thousands of images for one vessel alone. Back aboard the research vessels, powerful processing systems combine those photographs into digital reconstructions accurate to within millimeters. The resulting models preserved not merely the general appearance of the ships, but their exact geometry, surface texture, structural relationships, and positional arrangement on the seabed itself. The effect transformed underwater archaeology completely. A researcher sitting at a computer in Southampton could rotate a 2,400-year-old Greek merchant vessel freely in digital space without ever descending beneath the sea. Measurements could be taken directly from the model. Specific construction details, such as mortise and tenon joints, could be enlarged and studied in extraordinary detail. Surface wear patterns left by rope friction or repeated human contact became visible from multiple angles, impossible during ordinary physical examination. The models also solved a deeper archaeological problem connected to raising shipwrecks from the seabed. Once a vessel is lifted, its original spatial arrangement inevitably changes. Timbers shift under gravity. Fragile sections deform during transport. Conservation treatments alter textures and dimensions subtly over time. Even under the best conditions, recovery interrupts the exact geometry created when the ship settled underwater centuries earlier. The Black Sea models preserve that geometry permanently. Each wreck remains recorded precisely as it was found, resting within the sediment in the same orientation reached at the end of its final descent. Cargo distribution, collapsed rigging, stacked amphorae, steering systems, and scattered personal objects all remain fixed within the digital reconstruction exactly where they lay on the seafloor. This means archaeologists can examine not only the ship itself, but the moment of sinking preserved around it. The arrangement becomes evidence. Every object retains contextual meaning through its position relative to everything nearby. The detail captured through photogrammetry extends astonishingly far. Individual tool marks left by shipwrights remain visible within hull planks. Weathering patterns on wood surfaces can be analyzed remotely. Rope ends preserve twists and fibers formed by hands that vanished thousands of years ago. Cleats worn smooth by repeated handling retain the physical traces of labor aboard working ships. Unlike physical wrecks, these digital reconstructions can also be duplicated endlessly without deterioration. Universities, museums, and research institutions across different countries may study identical models simultaneously without disturbing the actual sites at all. In a strange way, the technology creates museums without removal. The ships remain in darkness beneath the Black Sea, while their forms travel globally through light, mathematics, and stored data. Future researchers not yet born may someday examine these models long after the original expeditions have passed into history themselves. The vessels survived through chemistry and isolation. Now they continue into another form of preservation altogether, translated carefully from submerged wood into permanent digital memory. The shipwrecks resting across the Black Sea floor feel ancient because they are ancient, yet even they arrived late compared with the landscape beneath them. Under the sediment, where the vessels now rest, lies the buried outline of another world entirely, one older than Greek trade routes, older than Byzantium, older than written history around the Black Sea basin. Before the catastrophic flooding transformed the region into the sea known today, this basin held a vast freshwater lake bordered by inhabited shorelines, river valleys, and low coastal plains, where human communities lived for generations. The traces of that vanished landscape did not disappear completely when the water rose. They remained buried beneath accumulating layers of mud and sediment, sealed slowly beneath the deep basin. Researchers, searching for evidence of that drowned world, relied heavily on sub-bottom profiler sonar, a technology capable of looking beneath the visible seafloor itself. Acoustic pulses travel downward through the sediment and reflect differently depending on the density and structure of buried layers below. By analyzing those returning signals, scientists can reconstruct geological features hidden beneath thousands of years of accumulated deposits. The images produced through these surveys reveal shapes that no longer belong to the modern Black Sea environment. Ancient river channels remain visible beneath the sediment, winding across the basin floor in patterns formed when freshwater streams once flowed openly toward the lower prehistoric lake. Their banks and valley structures persist with remarkable clarity despite being buried for millennia. In some survey regions, entire shoreline systems appear preserved as subtle discontinuities within the sediment layers. Former coastal erosion surfaces, beach formations, and slope breaks still mark where the edge of the prehistoric lake once existed before rising water submerged everything beneath tens of meters of seawater. What is now deep basin floor was once dry land where people may have walked, built shelters, fished, stored grain, and watched weather move across freshwater shores. The possibility of human settlement along those vanished coastlines is not speculative in itself. Human communities consistently formed near stable freshwater sources throughout prehistory, especially in fertile regions supporting fishing and early agriculture. Archaeological evidence from surrounding areas strongly suggests people lived around the ancient lake basin before the inundation transformed the environment completely. What remains uncertain is how much of that world still survives beneath the sediment. During portions of the Black Sea Map Survey, remotely operated vehicles recorded unusual features scattered across sections of the seafloor. Some appeared as regular stone arrangements or geometric patterns, difficult to explain through ordinary geological processes alone. In other locations, researchers observed concentrations of material whose organization suggested deliberate placement rather than natural accumulation. The evidence remains inconclusive. Marine archaeology moves carefully when interpreting possible human structures beneath complex underwater environments. Natural rock formations can mimic artificial geometry surprisingly well, especially after burial, erosion, and sediment compression across thousands of years. The research teams therefore avoided dramatic conclusions and described the findings cautiously. Still, the possibility lingers beneath the data. If settlements once stood along the shores of the prehistoric freshwater lake, then at least some may have been overtaken during the catastrophic flooding event that reshaped the basin approximately 7,000 500 years ago. Houses, storage pits, fishing infrastructure, pathways, and tools may now rest beneath layers of sediment below the same oxygen-starved waters, preserving the later shipwrecks above. The chemistry that protected Greek and Byzantine vessels may also have protected traces of prehistoric human life buried deeper still. In that sense, the wrecks discovered by Black Sea Map occupy only the upper layer of a much older archive. Merchant ships from classical antiquity descended eventually into darkness, already covering an erased landscape beneath them. Sailors, crossing the basin centuries later, had no knowledge that entire prehistoric coastlines rested below their hulls. The Black Sea, therefore, preserves multiple drowned worlds at once. One belongs to recorded history, visible through cargo vessels, anchors, amphorae, and rigging preserved on the seabed. The other belongs to a period before writing reached the region at all, a human landscape erased by rising water and sealed beneath the sediment long before the first ancient ship entered the basin. The ships rest in a graveyard of voyages. The graveyard itself may rest above the buried remains of a vanished shore. Far above the preserved wrecks, nations argue across invisible lines drawn through water. The ships discovered by Black Sea Map rest in one of the most politically fragmented maritime regions on Earth. Turkey controls the Bosphorus. Bulgaria and Romania hold the western coast. Ukraine stretches along the northwestern basin. Russia and Georgia border the east. Maritime boundaries intersect with disputed territories, shifting alliances, military tensions, and competing interpretations of international law. Beneath all of it, in darkness untouched by sunlight, the wrecks remain motionless, while modern states debate who possesses authority over objects no civilization knew existed until recently. The legal structure, intended to protect underwater archaeological heritage, is incomplete even under stable conditions. UNESCO's Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, established in the early years of the 21st century, created broad principles discouraging commercial exploitation of archaeological sites beneath the sea. The convention encourages preservation in place whenever possible and attempts to limit treasure hunting that destroys historical context for private sale. Yet international agreements possess only as much force as participating nations choose to grant them. Not every country bordering the Black Sea has ratified the convention in the same way, and enforcement mechanisms remain uneven even where formal participation exists. Maritime archaeology, therefore, occupies a strange legal territory, suspended somewhere between scientific preservation, national ownership, and the economic temptations attached to rare historical artifacts. Some of the wrecks identified during the survey lie within exclusive economic zones claimed clearly by individual nations. Others exist in areas where maritime boundaries remain politically sensitive or actively disputed. The geography of the Black Sea concentrates these tensions into relatively narrow spaces. A shipwreck sitting silently on the seabed may fall within waters interpreted differently by neighboring governments, each carrying separate legal frameworks and historical claims. For now, depth itself provides the strongest practical protection. Many of the documented wrecks rest between roughly 300 and 1,000 meters below the surface, beyond the reach of ordinary diving operations and far beyond the capabilities of recreational salvage. Recovering artifacts from such depths requires specialized remotely operated vehicles, support ships, navigation systems, manipulator arms, and highly trained technical crews. Even locating a specific wreck in darkness across the enormous basin demands expensive survey infrastructure unavailable to most organizations. Still, The same technologies that allowed researchers to document the wrecks could also allow determined operators to disturb them. Maritime archaeology has already lost enormous amounts of historical information through trophy collecting, a process often less dramatic than full-scale treasure hunting, yet equally destructive to scientific understanding. An amphora removed casually from a wreck site becomes detached from the exact spatial relationships that gave it archaeological meaning. Its position within the cargo hold, its orientation, the surrounding objects near it, the sediment covering it, all of these details contain information about trade systems, loading practices, chronology, and shipboard organization. Once disturbed, without documentation, that information disappears permanently. A single removed object may therefore erase far more knowledge than the object itself could ever provide in isolation. Archaeology depends not only on artifacts but on context, the invisible web of relationships connecting every preserved detail within a site. The Black Sea wrecks remain exceptionally valuable precisely because that context survived intact for centuries beneath undisturbed sediment and chemically stable water. The Black Sea map team understood this vulnerability from the beginning. One reason the researchers moved quickly to publish survey results, imagery, and photogrammetric models was to establish a public scientific record of each wreck before unauthorized disturbance could occur. Documentation creates accountability. If artifacts later disappear, researchers possess evidence showing precisely what was once present and where it rested on the seabed. Even so, preservation ultimately depends less on chemistry than restraint. The sea protected these vessels accidentally, through conditions no human authority designed or maintained. Oxygen vanished, decomposition slowed, and centuries passed in silence. Human curiosity now enters that silence, carrying cameras, robotic arms, legal disputes, commercial interests, and national ambitions. The wrecks endured storms, flooding, empire, war, and geological catastrophe. Whether they endure modern attention may depend on decisions made far above the cold water that preserved them for so long. For thousands of years, the chemistry of the Black Sea changed so slowly that human civilization rose and transformed around it without noticing. Empires appeared along its shores, traded across its surface, collapsed into history, and vanished. Languages shifted, religions spread, borders moved. Yet beneath the water, the separation between oxygen above and anoxic darkness below remained remarkably stable, held in balance by temperature, salinity, depth, and the quiet physics of layered water masses. The wrecks resting in the deep basin survived because that balance endured through every century that followed their sinking. But geological stability does not necessarily guarantee future stability. The Black Sea today exists inside a planetary system increasingly altered by industrial activity. Surface temperatures across the basin have been rising over recent decades, following the broader warming trend affecting oceans and enclosed seas throughout the world. Warmer water behaves differently from colder water. It becomes less dense, lighter, more resistant to sinking. In the Black Sea, this matters because the entire preservation system depends upon the persistent separation between the fresher upper layer and the dense ancient salt water below. That separation functions almost like a seal. Cold, dense water beneath the chemocline remains isolated because the contrast between layers discourages vertical mixing. Oxygen carried by the atmosphere and by surface biological activity therefore stays mostly confined to upper depths, while the lower basin remains chemically cut off. If surface warming continues reducing density differences between these layers, the barrier maintaining that isolation may weaken. Even partial mixing events could begin transporting oxygen downward into depths that have remained anoxic since long before recorded history. The process would not announce itself dramatically. No single storm or visible transformation would necessarily mark the beginning. Chemistry changes quietly. Water masses shift slowly. Yet oxygen entering the deep basin would carry enormous consequences for the wrecks preserved there. The absence of oxygen prevented aerobic bacteria, fungi, and shipworms from functioning. Reintroducing it would reactivate biological processes suspended for centuries. At the same time, another pressure approaches from above. The rivers feeding the Black Sea drain vast agricultural regions across Europe and Western Asia, particularly through the Danube Basin. Modern agriculture releases large quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus into these waterways through fertilizers washed from fields by rainfall and erosion. When those nutrients reach the Black Sea, they stimulate intense blooms of algae and microscopic plankton near the surface. For a short time, these blooms increase biological productivity. Then the organisms die. As they sink and decompose, bacteria consume oxygen during the breakdown process, creating expanding oxygen-depleted zones within the water column. In many coastal seas around the world, similar nutrient loading has produced what marine scientists call dead zones, regions where oxygen levels fall too low to support most marine life. In the Black Sea, nutrient pollution interacts with an already fragile, layered system. Surface warming potentially weakens the upper boundary of stratification from above, while decomposition driven by nutrient overload alters oxygen dynamics from below. The result is a basin being chemically pressured from both directions at once. Researchers studying ancient climate records preserved in Black Sea sediments know the system has not remained perfectly unchanged across all geological time. Evidence suggests earlier episodes of disrupted stratification occurred during periods of major climatic instability long before human civilization emerged along these shores. The conditions maintaining the modern chemocline therefore belong not to permanence, but to equilibrium, delicate and contingent even across long stretches of time. If that equilibrium failed again, the preserved wrecks would enter an entirely different biological world. Teredo nivalis still lives in the oxygenated upper waters of the Black Sea today, suspended there generation after generation, unable to descend into the depths where the ships rest. A breakdown in stratification would not require centuries to affect the wrecks. Shipworm larvae could colonize exposed timbers rapidly once oxygen became available. Bacteria and fungi would follow. Wood that survived unchanged through 2,400 years of darkness could begin softening and collapsing within a human lifetime. The ships endured storms, conquest, trade, and the collapse of empires. What surrounds them now is something older than politics and larger than archaeology. A planetary alteration unfolding molecule by molecule through water, atmosphere, soil, and heat, long before magnetic compasses became common at sea, and centuries before mechanical chronometers made precise longitude possible. Sailors crossed the Black Sea carrying most of their navigational system inside memory. Nothing about these voyages was improvised. The men guiding Greek, Byzantine, and Ottoman vessels across the basin inherited an accumulated body of observation refined through generations of repetition. Knowledge moved from captain to apprentice, from older sailor to younger one, not through formal instruction manuals, but through practice, correction, and survival. A navigator learned the sea gradually, storing coastlines, currents, winds, depths, landmarks, and stars as intimately as a shepherd memorizes hills or grazing paths. At night, the sky became the primary chart. Polaris, the North Star, provided the most stable reference point available to ancient navigators in the Northern Hemisphere. Unlike most stars, which appear to move across the heavens as Earth rotates, Polaris remains almost fixed above the northern horizon. By keeping that star at a consistent angle relative to the ship, sailors could maintain a reasonably stable heading even in darkness far from shore. Other constellations added further orientation. The rising and setting positions of familiar stars shifted predictably through the seasons, creating a celestial calendar that experienced navigators read instinctively. The sea itself also carried information. Wave direction revealed prevailing winds beyond the visible horizon. Changes in water color hinted at approaching river mouths or shallow coastal sediment. Seabirds flying outward at dawn and returning near dusk indicated the proximity of land. Certain cloud formations gathered repeatedly above mountain ranges, hidden beyond curvature and distance. Even smell played a role. Forested coasts carried distinct scents under particular winds, especially after rain. Daylight navigation depended heavily upon the sun. Experienced sailors observed the arc of sunlight across the sky and estimated orientation from its changing position through morning, noon, and evening. Around midday, when the sun reached its highest point, navigators could approximate latitude through accumulated familiarity with seasonal solar height. The measurements lacked mathematical precision by modern standards, yet they proved sufficiently reliable to sustain extensive commercial networks linking ports across hundreds of kilometers of open water. The Black Sea itself encouraged seasonal discipline. Ancient mariners understood its weather patterns intimately, even without formal meteorology. Northeasterly winds dominated colder months, descending across the steppes and mountain corridors with dangerous force. Summer conditions brought more predictable southerlies and calmer intervals favorable for trade. Captains therefore timed voyages around seasonal wind behavior, rather than attempting to overpower unfavorable conditions through brute seamanship alone. Near coastlines, another navigational method became critically important. The lead sounding weight, already familiar from preserved wrecks, functioned as both depth finder and geological sampler. Sailors lowered the heavy lead weight overboard on marked lines while approaching harbors or navigating uncertain coastal waters. At the base of the weight sat a hollow cavity filled with tallow, a dense animal fat capable of trapping fragments from the seabed below. When retrieved, the sounding weight carried traces of underwater terrain back to the deck. Dark mud, pale sand, crushed shell, gravel, or fine silt each corresponded to specific coastal regions known through repeated voyages. In experienced hands, these sediment samples became a remarkably precise positional system. A navigator comparing depth with seabed texture could identify approximate location even before land emerged through fog or darkness. The method resembled reading fingerprints pressed into the sea floor itself. The wreck distribution mapped by Black Sea Map aligns closely with the maritime corridors described in surviving Greek and Byzantine texts. Ships clustered along known commercial routes, connecting colonies, grain ports, fishing centers, and imperial trade hubs. This pattern confirms that ancient navigation was not primitive wandering across uncertain water. These sailors operated within structured systems of accumulated environmental knowledge refined over centuries of repeated travel. Most voyages, therefore, ended exactly where intended. A captain departing from Sinope or Chersonesos usually reached the next harbor safely, because generations before him had already memorized the winds, currents, depths, and seasonal rhythms shaping the route. The preserved wrecks exist partly because they were exceptions, rare moments when weather shifted too quickly, visibility failed, structural weakness emerged, or human judgment encountered conditions beyond previous experience. The sailors knew the sea with extraordinary intimacy, yet every crossing still depended upon an agreement between memory and water, and occasionally the sea answered differently than it had before. The preserved ships resting beneath the Black Sea now carry archaeological labels, catalog numbers, and survey coordinates, but none of those names belong to the people who sailed them. Somewhere above each wreck, centuries ago, there were men standing on wet deck planks watching weather move across the horizon. They argued over cargo prices, worried about delayed arrivals, cursed damaged rigging, counted remaining water stores, and memorized coastlines, fading into evening haze. The amphorae stacked in their holds belonged to merchants and investors, but the labor of moving those goods across dangerous water belonged to the crews themselves, men whose individual histories have mostly dissolved from the written record even while the objects around them survived. Merchant sailors occupied an uneasy place within the societies surrounding the Mediterranean and Black Sea worlds. Coastal cities depended completely upon maritime commerce for grain, oil, timber, metals, pottery, and countless other necessities, yet sailors themselves often remained socially peripheral. Landowners, magistrates, and aristocrats controlled wealth and political authority. Sailors carried the physical burden of sustaining the trade networks that made such wealth possible, while spending much of their lives moving between ports where they possessed little lasting status. Ancient literature reflects this tension repeatedly. Writers describe sailors as rough, transient, superstitious, unreliable, and difficult to govern, men shaped more by weather and commerce than by civic life. Yet those same societies entrusted them with the movement of food supplies, military cargoes, tax revenues, and communication between distant territories. The maritime economy depended upon skills most inland elites neither possessed nor fully understood. Unlike agricultural labor or mining, seafaring could not easily operate through simple coercion alone. A ship crossing unpredictable water required constant judgment, rapid decision-making, and technical knowledge accumulated through experience. Rigging adjustments during changing winds, navigation near dangerous shoals, cargo balancing, sail management during storms, and emergency repairs at sea demanded initiative impossible to enforce efficiently through chains or overseers. As a result, although slavery existed throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, merchant crews remained composed primarily of free working men whose expertise carried practical value. Most trading vessels documented in the Black Sea Wreck Survey likely carried crews between roughly 5 and 15 sailors, depending on ship size, cargo, and voyage length. Every additional crew member increased food consumption and reduced available cargo space, so commercial efficiency favored small crews operating at the practical minimum required for safe handling. These men, therefore, lived in close physical proximity for weeks or months at a time, sleeping beside cargo, sharing confined deck space, and depending upon one another continuously. Payment systems intensified the risks already built into maritime life. Many sailors earned wages tied directly to the commercial success of the voyage itself. A profitable arrival could mean substantial earnings relative to ordinary labor on land, especially if market conditions favored the cargo upon reaching port. A failed voyage meant little or nothing. Storm, piracy, spoilage, political disruption, or shipwreck could erase months of labor instantly. Maritime work, therefore, attracted individuals willing to accept uncertainty in exchange for the possibility of greater reward than stable agricultural labor usually offered. For many sailors, the sea became the dominant geography of adulthood. They moved repeatedly between ports scattered across the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean, wintering in foreign harbors while waiting for favorable sailing seasons to return. Relationships formed across languages and coastlines. Some men likely spent more time aboard ships than within any permanent home. Their sense of belonging emerged less from citizenship within a single city and more from familiarity with routes, harbors, seasonal winds, and the rhythms of maritime commerce itself. The preserved objects inside the wrecks narrow that enormous historical distance unexpectedly. A worn cooking pot, resting beside a collapsed hearth, belonged to specific hands that once lifted it daily. A rope still wound carefully around a wooden cleat preserves the final work of a sailor who expected to untie it again later. A water jar carried the drinking supply for men standing watch through cold night crossings beneath unfamiliar stars. The sea erased their names almost completely. What remains instead are the gestures of ordinary work, suspended in darkness long after the people themselves disappeared. Quiet evidence that these ships were never abstractions, moving cargo through history, but temporary floating homes, carrying living crews from one uncertain horizon toward another. Most of what humanity once wrote no longer exists. Ancient libraries vanished through fire, moisture, war, neglect, theft, political collapse, and simple indifference. Papyrus rotted, ink faded. Shelves disappeared beneath ruined roofs and drifting ash. Entire archives survived or vanished according to fragile chains of chance extending across centuries. A manuscript copied repeatedly by generations of scribes might persist into the modern world, while another text of equal value disappeared forever because one building burned during a siege or one monastery collapsed during an earthquake. The written history inherited today is therefore not a complete account of the ancient world. It is a filtered survival. Certain voices pass through that filter more successfully than others. Wealthy administrators, imperial chroniclers, philosophers, military leaders, merchants, and religious institutions produced records more likely to be copied and preserved. Ordinary laborers rarely wrote at all. Sailors left even less behind. Maritime commerce sustained entire civilizations, yet the practical realities of ship construction, cargo handling, navigation, crew organization, and daily life at sea often survived only in fragments scattered through poetry, legal contracts, inscriptions, and brief technical references. The sea records differently. A shipwreck preserves information not because anyone intentionally documented it, but because a specific moment became physically trapped. Cargo remained where it settled. Ropes stayed tied where sailors last secured them. Hull planks preserved the marks left by shipwright tools. The arrangement of amphorae inside a hold recorded loading decisions made on a particular morning centuries ago. None of this depended upon literacy, political importance, or cultural prestige. The evidence survived because chemistry, sediment, depth, and darkness happened to protect it. Before the Black Sea discoveries, historians already knew Greek and Byzantine merchant shipping existed. Ancient art depicted vessels crossing stylized waves. Relief sculptures showed rigging and hull shapes. Written texts described storms, harbors, trade routes, and naval encounters, yet many practical details remained uncertain. Artistic representations simplified structures. Literary references assumed contemporary knowledge no longer shared by modern readers. Archaeological remains recovered elsewhere usually survived only as fragmented timbers scattered across oxygenated seabeds. The Black Sea wrecks altered that situation dramatically. The preserved Greek hulls revealed mortise and tenon joinery executed with a consistency and precision exceeding what many scholars had previously inferred from surviving artistic and textual evidence. Shipbuilders, separated by generations and geography, appear to have followed surprisingly standardized construction practices, suggesting organized technical traditions closer to industrial production than isolated craftsmanship. This refinement existed largely beyond the surviving literary record. Ancient texts praised maritime commerce, described voyages, and complained about storms, but they rarely documented ship construction with engineering precision. The wrecks, therefore, supplied direct physical evidence where written sources remained vague or silent. A preserved hull could answer arguments that manuscripts never resolved. Cargo distributions revealed similar surprises. Historians long tended to imagine ancient maritime trade as relatively simple movement between individual ports, cargo loaded in one city and delivered directly to another. Yet multiple Black Sea wrecks carried mixed amphora assemblages, originating from different production centers across the region. Ships accumulated goods gradually while moving through interconnected commercial networks rather than following narrowly linear routes. The holds preserved economic behavior the texts only hinted at. The repeated appearance of Sinopean amphorae across wrecks separated by centuries provided another example. Written records acknowledge Sinope as an important Black Sea settlement, but the archaeological recurrence of its containers across so many different vessels demonstrated a level of sustained commercial centrality impossible to establish confidently through surviving documents alone. The sea preserved evidence of continuity that written history fragmented. Material evidence also corrects literary bias. Ancient writers often focused upon rulers, wars, diplomacy, and exceptional events because those subjects interested patrons and audiences with power. Shipwrecks record quieter realities instead. They preserve ordinary trade, repetitive labor, standardized craftsmanship, regional supply chains, and the practical systems sustaining daily civilization beneath the level of political spectacle. In that sense, the Black Sea functions almost like an alternative archive. Libraries preserve what people considered important enough to write down. The seabed preserves what people actually used, carried, built, repaired, traded, ate, and sailed. Both records remain incomplete. Both survive unevenly. Yet the ships resting beneath the anoxic water have retained details no surviving manuscript ever described, and no historian could fully reconstruct from text alone. The sea has been storing lost information in darkness, while entire written traditions disappeared above it. The map the researchers carried aboard the survey vessels always contained more empty space than confirmed discoveries. Across computer displays, the scanned portions of the Black Sea floor appeared as narrow corridors cut through an immense darkness. A few ship icons marked known wreck sites. Vast surrounding regions remained blank, not because nothing was there, but because no instrument had looked closely enough yet. The known ships occupied islands of certainty inside a landscape, still almost entirely unseen. The Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project surveyed roughly 2,000 square kilometers of seabed and documented 65 wrecks across that area. The total seafloor of the Black Sea spans approximately 423,000 square kilometers. Even allowing for the imprecision of ancient trade routes and the uneven distribution of maritime traffic, the surveyed region represented less than half of 1% of the available area. The arithmetic alone changes the scale of the story. If the density of wrecks identified within the surveyed corridors extended broadly across the remaining basin, the total number of preserved vessels resting below the chemocline would likely reach into the thousands. Not hundreds, thousands. Greek merchantmen, Byzantine grain carriers, Ottoman coastal traders, fishing boats, harbor craft, military escorts, and ships belonging to periods still poorly represented in the archaeological record may already be sitting beneath the sediment in complete darkness. Yet even that estimate may understate the reality. Ancient maritime movement was never evenly distributed. Certain coastlines carried far heavier traffic than others. Narrow approaches to river mouths concentrated shipping into dense corridors. Dangerous seasonal winds repeatedly drove vessels toward the same exposed stretches of open water. Harbors serving wealthy commercial centers attracted continuous movement for centuries at a time. A region experiencing intense traffic and difficult weather could accumulate wrecks generation after generation in the same general area. The northern Black Sea may contain some of the richest concentrations of all. The approaches to the ancient Greek colony of Olbia, near the mouth of the Dnieper River, formed one of the major commercial gateways of the classical world. Grain, timber, fish, wax, furs, and enslaved people moved through those waters toward Mediterranean markets for centuries. Yet deep survey coverage there remains extremely limited. Large portions of the northern basin have barely been examined with modern archaeological equipment at all. In some places, researchers suspect the visible wrecks may represent only the upper layer of preservation. Sub-bottom profiler systems used during the survey transmitted acoustic pulses downward through the seabed sediment and recorded reflections from buried layers beneath. These scans occasionally revealed anomalies below the visible seafloor surface, shapes and discontinuities consistent with objects concealed under accumulated silt. A ship sinking into soft sediment could gradually disappear beneath later deposits over centuries, leaving no exposed structure for cameras or conventional sonar to detect. A buried wreck would likely survive in even more extraordinary condition than those already documented. Sediment forms an additional protective barrier against physical disturbance. Minor bottom currents, drifting fishing equipment, and occasional mechanical contact affect exposed structures first. Beneath compacted mud, a wooden hull enters an environment almost entirely isolated from motion. Cargo remains fixed. Timbers remain supported. Organic material can persist in remarkable detail when sealed away from oxygen and mechanical stress simultaneously. Some ships may therefore lie preserved, not only intact, but hidden completely, their existence detectable only through faint acoustic signatures deep beneath the seabed. The scale of undiscovered history becomes difficult to visualize. Somewhere below the Black Sea may rest vessels from periods not yet represented in the survey record. Some may contain cargoes never previously identified archaeologically. Some may preserve construction methods absent from surviving texts and artistic depictions. Entire regional trade systems may still exist only as buried patterns, waiting for sufficient survey coverage to reveal them. What has already been found feels immense because the preservation is so complete. Yet the statistical reality surrounding those discoveries suggests something even larger and quieter beneath the surface. The 65 documented wrecks are not a finished catalog of a lost maritime world. They are the first clear glimpse into an archive whose full dimensions still remain hidden under darkness, chemistry, and sediment. Long before remotely operated vehicles descended into the Black Sea carrying cameras and sonar, other bodies of water had already been preserving fragments of human movement in their own quieter ways. The Baltic Sea, enclosed by northern Europe and diluted by enormous freshwater input from surrounding rivers, became one of the first places where underwater archaeologists realized that some environments interrupt the normal cycle of marine decay. Its salinity is lower than that of the open Atlantic, and in many regions, the cold remains stable through the year. Organisms that typically consume submerged wood struggle there. The result is a seafloor scattered with ships that appear improbably complete for their age. Warships from the 17th and 18th centuries rest upright beneath Baltic waters, with steering wheels still mounted, cargo barrels still stacked, and sections of rigging still hanging from masts that collapsed centuries ago. In some wrecks, carved decorative surfaces remain sharply defined enough for individual chisel marks to be visible beneath marine growth. Divers entering these sites often describe the sensation not as excavation but as intrusion into paused spaces, rooms abandoned suddenly and then sealed by temperature, darkness, and chemistry. The Great Lakes of North America preserve ships differently, though with similar results. Fresh water changes the equation entirely. The wood-boring organisms that consume submerged timbers across most oceans evolved within saltwater systems and cannot survive in large freshwater basins. Combined with low temperatures and long winter ice cover, the lakes create conditions unusually hostile to decomposition. Storms still destroy ships there, iron still corrodes slowly, and wood eventually weakens. Yet the pace of destruction becomes stretched across spans of time that feel disproportionate to human memory. Lake Huron's Thunder Bay region alone contains hundreds of wrecks from the 19th century, many resting in water clear enough for deck structures, anchors, and collapsed rigging to remain plainly visible from above. Schooners lost carrying lumber or grain still preserve the geometry of working vessels, their hull lines resting against pale sediment exactly where they settled after sinking. Some wrecks remain so structurally coherent that they resemble vessels merely abandoned rather than destroyed. Even these preserved lakes and inland seas, however, exist within environments where oxygen is still present. The Black Sea differs because the absence itself became the preservative. Yet, beyond continental shelves and enclosed basins lies another possibility, one far more difficult to study. In parts of the deep ocean below approximately 4,000 meters, temperature drops close to freezing, sunlight disappears entirely, and oxygen concentrations can become unusually low. Pressure rises to levels difficult, even for modern submersibles, to tolerate for extended operations. Archaeology at such depths remains extraordinarily expensive and technically restrictive, which means very few sites have been investigated in detail. Some marine researchers suspect these abyssal environments may preserve organic material better than the more biologically active middle depths above them. Certain deep ocean wrecks discovered accidentally during geological surveys have shown slower than expected deterioration rates, suggesting that cold, darkness, and reduced oxygen together may interrupt decomposition more effectively than previously understood. The hypothesis remains uncertain because humanity has examined so little of its own seafloor. Modern bathymetric mapping has improved rapidly in recent decades, yet meaningful high-resolution surveys still cover less than a quarter of the global ocean floor. Vast stretches of seabed remain represented only by broad topographic approximations. Entire mountain ranges, valleys, fracture zones, and sediment plains continue to exist beyond detailed observation. Archaeological sites resting there remain effectively invisible unless a research vessel passes almost directly overhead with the correct equipment, active at the correct moment. Which means the Black Sea may not be unique in principle. It may simply be the first place where chemistry, preservation, technology, and human curiosity aligned clearly enough for the pattern to become visible. A project searching for drowned prehistoric coastlines crossed paths instead with an archive of preserved ships, and through those ships revealed a larger possibility beneath the surface of the planet. The oceans do not erase history evenly. Some waters consume quickly. Some hold things gently for a while before releasing them into collapse. And in a few rare places, under conditions shaped by geography and time, the sea keeps what falls into it with an almost impossible patience. Human history is usually imagined as movement. Empires expand outward. Borders shift. Religions spread. Languages divide into new forms. Cities rise above older cities, and generations pass across the surface of the planet, leaving behind roads, ruins, graves, and rewritten maps. Even stone changes under enough centuries. Marble softens, bronze corrodes. Rivers alter their courses, and coastlines retreat from the places where ancient harbors once stood. Yet beneath the Black Sea, one vessel has remained almost entirely outside that motion. The oldest confirmed wreck, documented by the survey, descended into darkness around 400 BCE. At that moment, Plato was still alive in Athens, writing dialogues in a city unsettled by the long shadow of the Peloponnesian War. Macedon remained a peripheral kingdom at the edge of Greek affairs. Alexander, who would redraw the known world before dying at 32, had not yet been born. A ship carrying cargo across the Black Sea entered a storm somewhere beyond sight of land. Water crossed the rail. Sailors lowered anchors or cut rigging or shouted instructions, now permanently lost. The hull filled. Gravity took hold. Then the vessel passed below the chemocline into water that would not allow ordinary decay to continue. Everything after that belongs to recorded history. The conquests of Alexander unfolded while the wreck already rested in darkness. The Roman Republic expanded, transformed into empire, fractured, and disappeared. Christianity spread outward from the eastern Mediterranean, first as a persecuted faith, then as imperial authority. Islamic civilizations emerged from Arabia and reshaped trade, science, language, and power across 3 continents. Crusaders crossed seas. Mongol armies moved across Eurasia. Constantinople rose into magnificence and later fell beneath Ottoman siege. The ship did not move. Centuries continued accumulating above it. The Black Death crossed Europe and Western Asia. Printing presses multiplied books faster than scribes ever could. Oceans once thought impassable became commercial routes, binding continents together through trade, migration, extraction, and conquest. Steam replaced sail. Telegraph cables carried language beneath oceans. Industrial cities expanded under coal smoke. Nations fought wars at scales earlier societies could scarcely imagine. Still, the vessel remained where it settled. Every political structure familiar to the crew vanished long ago. The economies that funded the voyage dissolved. The ports where the sailors traded changed rulers, alphabets, religions, and names. Languages spoken aboard that ship evolved so extensively that surviving descendants would sound foreign to the men who once used them naturally on deck. Yet, below approximately 150 meters, None of those transformations mattered. The water temperature remained near 8 degrees. No sunlight arrived. No current disturbed the sediment strongly enough to shift the hull. No Teredo nivalis larvae reached the timbers. No oxygen fed the organisms that normally consume wood and rope and woven fiber. Chemistry isolated the wreck from biological time, while human civilization continued changing overhead. The scale of that stillness becomes difficult to hold in the mind all at once. The rope coiled by a sailor before the voyage ended may still retain the curve of his hands. Amphorae stacked in the hold remain arranged according to the practical logic of men who disappeared more than 2 millennia ago. The tiller still extends from the stern, where someone once gripped it against rough water beneath a sky now permanently unreachable from the seabed. Not one of these objects survived because anyone intended them to survive. No ancient preservation chamber was constructed around the wreck. No guardians protected it. No museum cataloged it. The vessel entered a chemical environment shaped by geography, flood history, bacterial metabolism, and the absence of circulation. And that environment simply declined to complete the final stage of destruction. Above the wreck, history accelerated continuously. Below it, almost nothing happened at all. The contrast between those two clocks, one racing and one nearly still, is what gives the Black Sea its strange gravity. Entire civilizations passed across the surface while a wooden ship waited in darkness, unchanged enough that modern cameras could still recognize the ordinary human order left behind on its deck. Most archaeological sites speak in nouns. A bronze helmet, a collapsed wall, a broken cup, a blade sealed inside a burial chamber. The objects survive after the people who used them have disappeared, and historians work backward from those remnants, trying to reconstruct the movements and decisions that once surrounded them. Time usually strips away the smaller traces first. The temporary arrangements, the unfinished tasks, the gestures too ordinary to imagine preserving. The Black Sea wrecks preserved the gestures. On one vessel, a rope remains wrapped around a cleat in neat overlapping loops. The fibers have darkened with centuries underwater, but the pattern itself is unmistakably human. Someone stood on deck and coiled that line carefully enough that it would pay out cleanly when needed again. He was not creating an artifact. He was completing a routine task during a working voyage, likely while thinking about weather, cargo, wages, or the harbor still ahead. Then the voyage ended before the rope was touched again. The action remained there, uninterrupted for approximately 2,400 years. The amphorae resting inside the holds carry the same strange immediacy. Their arrangement is too deliberate to feel accidental. Rows follow the curves of the hull. Weight distribution changes subtly toward the centerline, where stability mattered most. Larger containers support smaller ones. Empty spaces remain where movement through the hold was necessary. Every decision reflects practical experience accumulated through countless earlier voyages. Some merchant or dockworker judged how those jars should sit against one another while the ship still floated at a harbor centuries before the Roman Empire reached its height. He shifted weight with his hands, tested balance beneath his feet, stepped back, adjusted the placement again, then climbed from the hold, believing the work complete. Modern cameras now study those choices from angles the men who made them could never have imagined. Even the sounding weights preserve traces of process rather than simply possession. These heavy lead tools were lowered repeatedly over the side to measure depth and identify seabed texture through tallow pressed into cavities at their base. Mud adhered differently from shell fragments. Coarse sand differed from gravel. Navigators learned coastlines partly through touch, transmitted upward along rope lines from unseen seafloor below. On some recovered sounding weights, residue still survives within the tallow cavity, which means the final sample taken before the ship sank may still remain physically attached to the instrument. The last seabed the navigator examined before weather or darkness or current overwhelmed the voyage. The intimacy of that preservation alters the feeling of the wrecks. A monument often creates emotional distance because it was intended to endure. Temples, statues, inscriptions, and royal tombs were built specifically to outlast the generations that produced them. The Black Sea ships contain almost none of that intention. Their surviving details belong instead to ordinary work performed without ceremony. Coiling rope, stacking cargo, securing lamps, storing tools, measuring water depth. Routine became permanent accidentally. That accident is what makes the wrecks feel unusually alive. The vessels do not present the ancient world as a sequence of finished historical outcomes. They preserve it in motion, interrupted midway through itself. A sailor was preparing for tomorrow's work without knowing there would be no tomorrow for him aboard that ship. A cook left equipment beside a hearth, expecting to light another fire after sunrise. A navigator checked depth, while still believing the coast ahead remained reachable. The sea kept those unfinished moments intact. Most archaeological evidence passes through layers of collapse before discovery. Buildings burn, rot, fragment, and scatter. Artifacts shift from their original positions. Context disappears gradually. The Black Sea wrecks escaped much of that process. They descended beneath the chemocline quickly enough that the ordinary sequence of biological destruction failed to continue. What remains, therefore, feels less like excavation and more like proximity. Not proximity to famous rulers or recorded battles, but to working human lives, suspended between one completed task and the next. The distance between present and ancient world narrows unexpectedly inside those dark hulls, because the evidence preserved there is not only what people owned, it is what they were doing. Most things on Earth disappear gradually. Wood softens and splits beneath rain. Metal oxidizes. Cloth frays into fibers too small to recognize. Buildings collapse first at their weakest points, then sink slowly into soil and memory together. Even mountains wear down under enough wind and water. Time usually behaves like erosion, reducing the sharp edges of existence until only fragments remain. The Black Sea wrecks escaped that process almost entirely. A ship sailing normally across the surface entered catastrophe, descended beneath the chemocline, and then encountered a world where the ordinary machinery of change no longer functioned correctly. Oxygen vanished. Biological decay slowed almost to stillness. Currents weakened. Sediment settled gently across hulls, already resting on the seabed. Instead of continuing toward fragmentation, the vessels entered a kind of arrested continuity. The moment of destruction became the beginning of preservation. That reversal gives the wrecks their strange emotional weight. Preservation is usually imagined as rescue. Museums preserve paintings from fire and humidity. Archives preserve documents from moisture and insects. Families preserve photographs because they fear forgetting the faces inside them. The word itself carries an assumption of care, intention, protection against loss. Nothing cared for these ships. No civilization built chambers around them. No ancient mariners intended their vessels to survive for millennia beneath the sea. The Black Sea did not choose to hold them. Geography, flood history, saltwater stratification Bacterial metabolism and the absence of oxygen combined accidentally into a system where destruction failed to complete itself. Yet the result resembles preservation more perfectly than almost anything human beings intentionally create. The ships are not ruins in the ordinary sense. A ruin shows transformation. Walls crack, roofs collapse, surfaces weather visibly over time. The Black Sea vessels often appear suspended outside, visible aging altogether. Rope remains coiled, cargo remains stacked, steering mechanisms remain attached where working hands last used them. The practical order imposed by living crews still shapes the interiors of the wrecks centuries after those crews disappeared from history. The asymmetry becomes difficult to ignore. The sailors are gone completely. Their bodies dissolved long ago in the upper oxygenated water column or along distant shores. Their descendants, if any can even be traced through centuries of migration and empire, would never know their names. Languages spoken aboard the ships either vanished or transformed beyond recognition. Religions changed. Governments collapsed. Trade routes shifted. Entire cities familiar to those crews disappeared beneath later construction or political reinvention. The vessels remained. A man who spent years learning the handling characteristics of a particular ship vanished within hours after it sank. The ship itself survived for approximately 2,400 years in darkness, almost unchanged. The labor outlived the laborer. The tools outlived the hands that shaped them. Objects endured while memory failed. There is something quietly unsettling in that imbalance. Human beings often imagine permanence belonging primarily to consciousness, legacy, lineage, and story, yet the Black Sea reverses those expectations. What persisted most completely were not identities or reputations, but arrangements of wood, rope, ceramic, and sediment held inside a chemically stable environment. The evidence of ordinary work survived more faithfully than the lives surrounding it. And still, even this preservation contains no meaning of its own. The sea does not remember intentionally. It does not mourn the ships resting within it. The chemistry below the chemicline operates without preference or sentiment. A Greek merchant vessel, a Byzantine grain ship, and an Ottoman trader all descend into the same darkness and encounter the same absence of oxygen. History becomes leveled there into material persistence alone. One by one, across centuries, ships entered that water, carrying food, cargo, tools, debts, conversations, fatigue, and plans for journeys not yet completed. Storms rose, hulls failed, water crossed the rails. Then the vessels descended through the chemocline into stillness, where the usual sequence of disappearance simply did not continue. Long before any research vessel lowered cameras into the Black Sea, the water had already become an archive. Not an archive built intentionally, with shelves and catalogs and guarded entrances, but one assembled gradually through physics and chance. Storm after storm, century after century, ships crossed the basin carrying grain, oil, timber, ceramics, rope, tools, letters, debts, rumors, and exhausted crews. Some completed their voyages and vanished upward into ordinary history. Others descended beneath the surface and entered the stillness below the chemocline, where the usual cycle of decay lost its grip. The sea kept them without knowing it was keeping them. Human beings usually treat memory as something conscious. A person remembers a face. A city preserves a monument. A civilization records laws and stories, so they will outlast the generation that created them. Memory appears tied to intention, to the deliberate refusal to let experience disappear completely. The Black Sea suggests another form of remembering altogether. In the deep anoxic water, Memory exists materially rather than mentally. It exists in the preserved grain of oak timbers, untouched by oxygen for approximately 2,000 years. It exists in stacked amphorae, whose positions still reflect the judgment of the dockworkers who loaded them. It exists in worn cleats, polished smooth by hands that vanished before most modern nations existed. No living mind carried these details forward continuously across the centuries. Chemistry carried them instead. The result is strangely impartial. Human archives preserve unevenly. Empires leave inscriptions, while laborers leave almost nothing. Kings commission chronicles while sailors disappear into brief mentions or complete silence. Fires consume libraries selectively. Political change determines which histories deserve copying and which are abandoned. The written past that survives into the present is shaped constantly by preference, power, wealth, literacy, and accident. The sea made no such distinctions. A modest coastal trader and a wealthy Byzantine grain ship entered the same darkness and encountered the same conditions. The Black Sea did not preserve vessels according to status or importance. It kept what descended into it. Cargo remained beside cargo. Ordinary tools survived beside luxury goods. Evidence of practical labor endured with the same fidelity as evidence of commerce and empire. In some ways, that makes the underwater record more democratic than the written one. The names of rulers survived elsewhere already, carved into stone and repeated through centuries of scholarship. What vanished most easily from conventional history were the unnoticed details of ordinary existence. How sailors arranged storage space aboard small merchant vessels, which knots they preferred for securing line, how cooking equipment was positioned near stern hearths, what combinations of cargo traveled together through particular routes at particular times of year. Those quiet details remained below the waterline. A sounding weight, still carrying traces of sediment, preserves the final navigational habits of a navigator, no text ever named. A repaired timber records the practical decisions of a shipwright whose existence survives nowhere else. A cluster of mixed amphorae reveals trading patterns more complicated than surviving commercial records suggested. The sea retained fragments of forgotten human routine with extraordinary precision, and it retained them silently. More than 300 meters beneath the surface, sunlight disappears completely. Sound travels strangely through the water. Pressure folds itself around every exposed surface. The wrecks rest there without witnesses for centuries at a time, unchanged except for the slow settling of fine sediment drifting downward through the dark. Then, briefly, modern light returns. An ROV passes overhead. Cameras record a mast still standing upright after 2 millennia. Researchers examine a rope coil last touched in the ancient world. Digital models recreate vessels whose crews would not recognize any surviving nation surrounding the sea they sailed. The water never intended to communicate these things. Yet the record remains, patient and intact beneath the Black Sea, where memory survives not because anyone preserved it, but because the chemistry of that drowned world refused to let it fully disappear. Far below the surface of the Black Sea, beneath storms and shipping lanes and the shifting politics of nations that now ring its shores, the water reaches a depth where sunlight has never naturally traveled. The temperature settles at approximately 8 degrees. Pressure folds inward from every direction with the force of 30 atmospheres. Oxygen disappears completely. In that dark, the seafloor holds at least 65 known ships, resting in positions so undisturbed that the smallest details of ordinary human activity still remain exactly where they were left. They were never meant to stay there. Each vessel was built for motion, for repetition, for the long rhythm of seasonal trade that connected distant coasts through grain, oil, timber, wine, ceramics, and human labor. Some of them probably crossed the Black Sea dozens of times before their final voyage. Crews repaired them between seasons. Sailcloth was patched and ropes replaced. Hulls were sealed against leaks with resin and fiber. Men loaded cargo according to instinct learned through years at sea, balancing weight carefully enough to survive another crossing. Then, at some specific hour now impossible to recover precisely, something failed. Wind shifted. Water entered the hull faster than it could be removed. A mast snapped under strain. Fire spread beyond the hearth. Cargo shifted violently in rough water. Anchors vanished downward in desperate attempts to hold position against weather already too strong to resist. One by one, over centuries, ships crossed the boundary beneath the chemocline and entered a part of the sea where the ordinary rules governing decay no longer operated. One vessel reached that stillness around the year 400 before the Common Era. At the time, Plato was still alive. Macedon had not yet produced Alexander. Rome remained a regional Mediterranean power rather than an empire. Entire future religions, nations, languages, and technologies still existed only as possibilities hidden inside unborn centuries. That ship settled onto the seabed and remained there while all of human history continued overhead. Empires expanded across continents and collapsed into fragments. Trade routes shifted. Constantinople rose beside the Bosphorus and later fell beneath Ottoman cannon fire. Printing presses appeared. Oceans were crossed. Industrial smoke entered the atmosphere. Railways, electricity, aviation, radio, satellites, nuclear weapons, computers, and the internet transformed the surface world completely. The ship did not participate in any of it. The rope aboard that vessel remains coiled exactly where a sailor left it more than 2 millennia ago. Not symbolically, not approximately. The fibers themselves still hold the shape pressed into them by human hands in the ancient world. Cold water, darkness, and the absence of oxygen prevented bacteria and wood-boring organisms from consuming what would normally vanish within decades. The sea did this accidentally. Thousands of years earlier, the catastrophic flooding that transformed the Black Sea basin drowned shorelines, forests, river valleys, and human settlements that had existed around the ancient freshwater lake before Mediterranean saltwater rushed inward. That disaster created the chemical stratification that later preserved every ship descending into the deep basin above the drowned landscape. One catastrophe prepared the conditions for another form of permanence, and the known wrecks represent only the smallest fraction of what may still be waiting below. Less than 1% of the Black Sea floor has been examined in meaningful archaeological detail. Vast stretches remain unsurveyed, including ancient trade corridors that carried traffic continuously for centuries. Beneath sediment, beneath darkness, beyond the reach of every camera deployed so far, more hulls almost certainly remain intact in the still water. They have been resting there through entire ages of human change. The sea has been patient with them. And in the deep Black Sea, where nothing decays and almost nothing lives, patience lasts a very long time.